Order, order. Can I welcome everyone to today's joint session, very unusual joint session of the Home Affairs and Northern Ireland Affairs Committees. We are holding this session in response to recent events in Northern Ireland to look at the response to the recent disorder in Belfast, which from the Home Affairs Select Committee view follows on from the work we did when we looked at the policing response to the disorder that we saw after the Southport attack in the summer of 2024. It will also explore the arrangements the government has in place to identify and respond to irregular migration to and from Northern Ireland, something that I know the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee looked at in its recent inquiry into policing and security in Northern Ireland. I do want to be clear, though, we're not linking the two issues. We want to understand the policing and we want to understand the issues around migration, but we are not making a link between the two. So we're going to start on the first panel with questions about the recent disorder before moving on to questions about irregular migration. But before we start our questioning, I should highlight that there are live criminal proceedings relating to the attack in Belfast on 8th of June and the subsequent disorder. In line with Parliament's sub judice rule, we will not be discussing the details of any individual cases. So I'm going to ask our witnesses to introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Mr. Beck, because he's online. Unfortunately, he's had travel problems, but I'm going to start with Mr. Beck, then I'll move to you, Mr. Montgomery, and then along. Davy. Is it working? It was working beautifully.
Cool. Yeah, I think you've got me now.
Right.
Yeah,
we have.
Super. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to appear virtually in front of you today. Davy Beck, I'm Assistant Chief Constable responsible for Crime Department within the PSNI. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Mr. Montgomery.
Good afternoon, everyone. Eddy Montgomery, I'm the Director for Enforcement, Compliance and Crime within Immigration Enforcement of the Home Office. I have responsibility for leading the UK's operational response to tackling irregular migration alongside law enforcement partners. That involves, to an extent but not exclusively, identifying, arresting and detaining individuals with no right to be in the United Kingdom, disrupting organised crime groups who violate or exploit immigration routes, managing those on immigration bail within our communities, and applying sanctions and penalties to those who try to access work, benefits and services who are unlawfully in the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair. My name is Miles Bonfield. I'm the Director of Investigations for the National Crime Agency.
Duncan Caps. I'm the Acting Director General of Border Security Commander. I've been in post since the 1st of April. I have cross-system leadership responsibility, principally focused on organisational immigration crime and protecting the UK borders.
Thank you very much. We'll start our questioning around the policing aspect, and I'll start with Adam Joji.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, gentlemen. And Davy, hello. I hope you're well. We were all concerned, outraged, horrified by the disorder on the streets of our United Kingdom, and I know all of our thoughts are with all those who were impacted, Davy. So can I ask you a couple of things, please? Firstly, can you just talk us through the PSNI's experience and response to the disorder we saw in Belfast a few weeks ago?
Okay, thank you. So unfortunately, this was the third year in a row that we in Northern Ireland have witnessed what I could only describe as atrocious violence and racism that impacted many of our communities who are still very much reeling from what was experienced. By way of background, we had a brutal knife attack in the North Belfast area on the evening of the 8th of June, which led to life-changing injuries being suffered by Mr. Stephen Ogilvie. And certainly he and his family are in our thoughts at this time. The suspect, in respect of that incident, was a foreign national with leave to remain in the UK. He was arrested promptly at the scene and has been subsequently charged with attempted murder. And as the Chair said, I'm conscious that remains before the courts, so I won't go in any further detail in respect of the specific details of the incident. What I would say, however, was that the attack was captured on video by a member of the public, and that footage went viral very quickly. Again, to give the committee some indication, our inquiries would indicate that the male suspect entered Northern Ireland via the Common Travel Area in February 2023. and was subsequently granted leave to remain in the UK until 2028. We do continue to investigate the origins of the male, with one potential line of inquiry indicating that he may potentially be from Chad, and not Sudan, as was initially indicated, and we continue to investigate that line of inquiry with the relevant authorities in Chad. However, following that, and throughout the 9th of June, we became aware of significant online calls for protests at sites across Northern Ireland. These calls, I would say, had a clear anti-immigration and extreme right-wing theme. There were also significant calls for people to come prepared for disorder. People were instructed, for example, to wear masks, to dress in black, and leave their electronic devices at home, we believe, in an attempt to frustrate police subsequent investigations. We then saw on the 9th of June really serious, sustained, and what I would describe as racially motivated disorder across Northern Ireland. Groups, mainly men, blocked roads, set fire to vehicles, and went street to street, destroying property and attacking the homes that they believed to belong to ethnic minorities. This was some of the most serious disorder and violence we have seen in Northern Ireland for many years. And I would have to say that had it not been for the response of police, supported, I would say, by colleagues from Fire and Rescue Service and the Ambulance Service, I have no doubt that lives could well have been lost on that night. No doubt some of you will have seen the footage of our officers evacuating families from their homes. Many of those had young children, and indeed one incident we saw children aged 6 and 8 being recovered from a house where their father had attempted to hide them. And in another incident, a 2-month-old baby was rescued by our officers and colleagues from Fire and Rescue Service. The following day, we again saw further calls for widespread protest, but thankfully disorder was more localized on that second night. But again, it caused considerable concern, and there were attacks both on our officers and attempts to attack the properties of migrants. This disorder was conducted by all I would describe as thugs. And they were responsible for targeting people simply because they perceived them not to be white. Many of those attacked have been resident in Northern Ireland for many years, and in some cases their entire lives. And many are key workers in our health service, and they contribute significantly to society, much more than the mindless thugs who targeted them. As I said, police officers came under sustained attack on both nights, and we had 49 officers injured, some suffering concussion, burns, and smoke inhalation, as well as other injuries. And I think it's fair to say that the Chief Constable has made it absolutely clear that we were stretched in those initial nights in terms of our response to those incidents of disorder. And as a consequence, this was the 3rd year in a row that we have had to summon mutual aid support from GB police colleagues. And we had in the region of 168 officers joined us from GB, and certainly I and my colleagues are very grateful for that support and assistance, which gave us that added resilience to sustain what was 2 significant nights of disorder and then return to normality thereafter. I would reassure the joint committees that a significant investigation team has been put in place to investigate this totally unacceptable disorder. And to date, we have made 35 arrests. 27 of those people have been charged directly to court. 7 have been bailed pending further investigative action, and 1 person is being reported to the Public Prosecution Service. The day after the outbreak of the disorder, we published the first image of a suspected rioter, and since then 16 sets of images have now been released into the public domain. And again, I think that illustrates that we are relentlessly pursuing those who are responsible. Indeed, 1 person has been charged with attempted murder, and there's been charges in respect of arson with intent to endanger life, which again, I think evidences the serious nature of what we were faced with. In addition to responding to the disorder, we put significant time and effort into engaging with our ethnic minority communities across Northern Ireland, and indeed have personally spoken to a number of representatives from these communities. I would say that these communities are still very much living in fear. People are afraid to go about their daily activity, and we have seen racist criminal damage and assaults and threats continue in parts of the country, and so clearly tensions remain high at this stage. And we continue to see and remove racist material across a number of locations. There has been speculation around paramilitary involvement, and the Chief Constable addressed the policing board last week specifically on this point. And I would again echo what we said at that point, that it is clear that members of loyalist paramilitary groups were present at some sites of the disorder and were involved in directing the violence at a number of locations. I'll pause there, Chair, and happy to take any follow-up questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beck, and thank you for the comprehensive and at times painful explanation of the PSNI's experience of what happened. And I join in your thanks to the emergency services. I'm sure that goes for all colleagues around the table on both committees. And so please pass those thanks on to the emergency workers who are on the front line. I do note two things, Chair, if you'll indulge me. Firstly, Mr. Beck, you mentioned that and I'm conscious of the rules, but Chad was mentioned, which is the third country, I think, in relation to this particular case. That could have unintended consequences on people from other parts of the world, and I think it's important just to note that whilst, of course, the speed and evolving of a situation like this is such, but communication being as accurate as possible is vital to mitigate some of the unintended consequences. Earlier today, Mr. Swan, my colleague from South Antrim, and I met with young people from Northern Ireland. They raised a number of issues with us, but one of them was the hurt and fear, and in some cases shame they felt after the events of what happened a few weeks ago. So I'd be grateful if you could expand a little bit on the disorder, impact of the disorder, on community cohesion in Belfast and across Northern Ireland.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I would summarise that in one word: fear, considerable fear. And that's been palpable across ethnic minorities, but also I think disappointment around the greater number of people in Northern Ireland who were also appalled by the sights that they saw. I think what I would say was that there was significant effort from the voluntary sector to assist, to support, to respond to the signs, often quietly behind the scenes. And I think that it's also important that we recognise the voluntary sector in their response to these incidents. I think that was quite significant, but I would say that there is still considerable fear, there is still considerable tension within communities, and we are still seeing, unfortunately, examples of that continued intimidation, offensive material, and that stoking up at a localized area of those fears and tensions. So we can continue to police those issues, and we continue to engage with the wide range of community representatives and ethnic minority representatives to get that feeling in terms of where they currently are, and to provide that support, that visibility, that reassurance. But I think the main response is in terms of the arrests and the proactive investigative response. It sends a clear message across those communities as well that we are responding to these issues.
Thank you. And the last question from me, Chair. And just to say, Mr. Beck, I'm of colour, I'm not white. I spend a lot of time in Northern Ireland as a result of family connections, and we all have a responsibility to ensure that Northern Ireland is viewed as, and in reality is, the safe place that many of us know it to be for anyone, whoever they are, wherever they're from, and all political leaders and, as you say, civic society have responsibility in making sure that happens. Now, you touched on the fact that and I didn't quite get the number, but there was a number of officers from GB who came over to help the PSNI response. That would be one of the challenges, presumably, capacity-wise, that the PSNI faced when policing the recent disorder in Belfast. What were the other challenges?
Yeah, certainly 168, just to be clear, officers from GB came to assist us as part of our mutual aid requirement, and that's the third year in a row we have had to ask for mutual aid. So I think that again emphasises many of the concerns that the Chief Constable has shared with you and the committee members in the past around our dire resourcing and our dire financial constraints that we continue to navigate through. Those officers' health, both in terms of deployment on the ground, but also providing that resilience and support to our public order units as they were facing into third and fourth night of deployment and a full mobilisation across PSNI. So that was really vital to have that additional support. Outside of the resourcing element, I think that issue around information and misinformation was key. This was, I suppose, the third year that we have had a trigger incident that has brought about disorder very quickly, fueled online, and therefore it has been difficult to predict in the usual sense of tensions, etc., that these incidents are inflaming tensions very, very quickly, and as a consequence, it is very hard to get ahead of that. I think that offers challenges, and you touched on it earlier around information and the speed of information. I think the learning from the terrible incidents in Southgate in 2024 and the guidance issued across police services in the United Kingdom has indicated that we have to be more fleet of foot in terms of our response, our information and our communication.
We're going to come on to some of those issues in a moment, Mr. Beck, so just you will get some more questions on that shortly.
Oh, okay. So really just to summarise, information and misinformation is another key issue for us.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I'm very interested by the point you made about the role paramilitary and sectarian organisations played. And I know the International Organisation for Migration has recently published a report about the exploitation of young people in Northern Ireland by those groups. So I'm not asking you to comment on it at the moment, but I just want to put it on the record as something that is of concern to many. But I'm going to turn now to my co-chair, Tonya.
Yes. You were talking about, misinformation and disinformation there, Davy. So what challenges does the use of social media by malign actors pose when responding to disorder?
Well, firstly, it's the speed at which those issues and that sort of echoing those messages, the speed at which the video of the incident found its way onto social media, the speed in terms of then the commentary, both from internally in Northern Ireland, but also from GB and indeed wider afield, I think compounded the issues and again inflated the tensions that ran as a consequence of that. We saw false reports in terms of the victim's condition, and indeed we saw false images portrayed to be the victim issued online as well, and gruesome images then that were published that were not correct, and the impact of that on the victim, the family, and tensions again as a consequence of that. So we have worked very hard in terms of our investigative stance in respect of the online commentary. And we have a number of, again, open investigations. I think there is a differential between what is repugnant and distasteful and what may well be criminal. But we are working our way through that with legal advice, and where there are opportunities, we will again progress those investigations with a view to bringing people before the courts if that is achievable. But again, some of this commentary is external to the UK, so the reach of that is significant. So that leads us to have issues around our response and our speed of response to the commentary, the misinformation. And I think we have learned from previous years. We were much quicker in terms of our media facilities, our commentary, the information we put out online. And as was touched on, sometimes in policing, we would tend to wait until we have all the information or the perfect sort of picture around the information. That was not possible in these circumstances. This was a real threat to life. The clock was ticking, so to speak. So I think we have to balance information in a timely fashion, that perhaps in the past we would have waited until we had the fuller picture or the entire information that was perhaps given more time to materialize. We don't have that luxury anymore.
No, but and you have mentioned there about the timelines and how important they are for you getting as ahead of the game as you can, really. And I get that, but then, you know, the accuracy of that information going out is also of great importance. You know, are there any issues around getting the right information out there for the police, for the PSNI?
But I think that is that balance between accuracy and time, and certainly checks and balances were put in place to ensure that we could stand over the accuracy at that time. But clearly, all these investigations and issues such as disorder are dynamic, very fast moving, and the picture will change over time as well. But I think it was incumbent on us to ensure that we provided communities and indeed ethnic minorities with factual information that we had at that time to try and reassure the greater number of people as to the actual position, the circumstances, and what we were doing to respond to that.
And so how do you work with the Home Office then to share that information about the ethnicity and immigration status of suspects?
Well, again, you know, there are national guidance around when police may consider disclosing the nationality and the ethnicity of a suspect. And we would believe that we acted within those guidelines, in that you know, there was that requirement to respond quickly and accurately for a policing purpose, which was about maintaining public confidence in the justice system, and therefore addressing the concerns. We were in communication with the Home Office, and we had spoken to the Home Office on a number of occasions just to relay what information we were aware of up to that point. So there was good communication, good onward discussions, but clearly we got to a point, and particularly when the Chief Constable was conducting a media facility with the First and Deputy First Minister, that we were required to call for calm, as you would expect, and for peaceful protest. And as part of that reassurance message, it was appropriate and right for our policing purpose that we provided information around the origins of the suspect at that time. And I think that helped at that minute in time in terms of providing reassurance and commentary, and being seen to get ahead of the fast moving sort of commentary online.
One of the things I wanted to pick up, Davy, and I know we've spoken about it before and with the Chief Constable, is around funding. Now, you said you had the mutual aid support from GB with 168 officers, and that was for the third year in a row you'd had to call on that mutual aid. And I think it's obvious you don't have the adequate resources to deal with the disorder. But to what extent was the £4 million funding that was provided by the UK government in the aftermath, to what extent was that adequate?
Well, certainly it's helpful in terms of that additional £4 million, and we would welcome that. Currently the cost of the disorder we would estimate to be in the region of 5.4 million. And the clock's still ticking on that. I still have significant resources as part of the investigative team dedicated to investigating the disorder. So the costs continue to rise. So the costs are in excess of the £4 million, but certainly that £4 million was critical when you balance that against our current financial situation. This year we have a funding gap of currently in the region of £75 million. That grows to £92 million next year, and the year after 149 million. So significant funding pressures exist this year and subsequent years based on our predictions at this minute in time. So clearly that £4 million is of a help, but it does not fulfill all the issues. And of course there is the probably the true cost to policing extends beyond the financial expenditure. It's also reflected in officers and staff being diverted from services to the community, services we want them to be providing within communities each and every day, and services that those communities rely on each and every day. So an example of that was we had to divert staff from our public protection branch. So from addressing some of the issues we talked about when we were last with you as a committee in terms of rape victims, domestic violence victims, violence against women and girls. So those officers, a number of those officers were diverted to deal with disorder. We had also officers who were investigating the recent terrorist attacks at Dunmory and Lurgan that were diverted into public order and investigative roles for this. So that impact goes wider than the financial impact.
And to tell you, and we've heard this all the time, especially when we were in Derry and Londonderry, from your community officers having to be moved when you have these disorder, such disorder. And this is the third year in a row. One of the other things that we've heard is that there have been cuts to youth outreach programmes. You've spoken about the voluntary sector quietly working behind the scenes. We heard in evidence last week that the funding has gone because of the implementation of the local growth fund. I just want to know, are you seeing that as a direct impact on the recent disorder? Because those volunteers are going out as volunteers. They're not going out as organised groups. Is them not being on the street, not being on the corners and looking and talking to these young people, is that having an impact on policing, and has that impacted on the disorder?
Okay, the first point in respect of protecting neighbourhood community officers, we worked really hard this year to protect those officers and to maintain those officers as much as possible within their communities, because we felt that that's where there was the most value in terms of that local engagement, local reassurance, local visibility right across Northern Ireland. So we worked hard to do that, and the mutual aid officers and actually the mobilisation across PSNI allowed us to do that. But there were other areas, as I've identified, that clearly we had to extract and abstract officers from at that time. But we take on board the comments around the need to protect neighbourhood and community officers. In terms of young people, what I would say, in respect of the 35 arrests that we have made so far, 5 of those have been juveniles. So we've maybe seen a shift, less juveniles involved in this disorder, and perhaps that does indicate the more coordinated sort of fashion of the disorder we saw this year. I would also comment that at the time of this disorder, the schools were not out for the summer break, so that may have had an impact on to some degree. So we have not as yet seen a spike in juvenile offending, but I think it's fair to say that there has been a reduction in provision around particularly the community sector in terms of some of those funding streams that you've mentioned. Certainly from a policing perspective, we are concerned about that, and I know there's concern in those communities as well around the ability for the voluntary sector to be able to maintain the level of diversionary activity that they would normally provide in the summer months. So unfortunately, we'll not really be in a position to assess that, I suspect, until we get to the end of the summer, and then we'll get some more indication around that. But perhaps that's too late to adjust this current year.
2 other quick ones from me, because I know we need to move on. How quick does the mutual aid from GB arrive, and did it arrive in time?
Well, we, again, taking the learning from the previous 2 years, we triggered that earlier this year. So we triggered that effectively on the first day following the disorder. And that was with us from Scotland within 24 hours of that trigger. So much quicker, much slicker. So again, that's where the learning comes in, but it's not a sustainable way to provide that public order sort of support, and it does come with significant costs around that as well.
Sorry to bombard you, but what, if any, additional support does the PSNI need from the UK government for any future disorder?
Well, our recovery plan has outlined the kind of key areas of support that we need, both in terms of resilience around our neighbourhood officers, around our investigative capability, and indeed our public order capacity. All of those are contained within the business recovery case that we have previously discussed with the committee in terms of what we need moving forward. And that's to regrow to around 7,000 officers and 2,500 staff. And there's still significant progress to be made if we are to fulfil that, and funding to allow us to do it.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
I'm conscious we need to move on, and we're bombarding you, Mr. Beck, with questions, but I've got a couple more questions for you, starting with Solskjaer Eastwood.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon, Mr. Beck. You've touched upon, I think you said, foreign actors in terms of the social media space throughout this disorder, and there were images and pictures shared that were actually in Russia, but were purporting to be areas in Northern Ireland. And there's a temptation to make things about us and that we are very special and unique in Northern Ireland, but actually this could have been anywhere in the United Kingdom, and we have seen that over the last number of years. So Mr. Beck, my question really is, and I suppose anybody on the panel, is really in terms of, this is a national security issue. This is aggravated by local and historic factors within Northern Ireland, but my fear now is that there are foreign actors who are desperately wanting to try and destabilise our democracy. You'll be very aware of the Defending Democracy Task Force and some of the measures that we're trying to take through the Representation of the People Bill. But last weekend, at a parade in Belfast, it's my understanding that Wi-Fi was actually disabled, and that was presumably done as a measure to stem rioting or potential riotous behaviour. Could you give any more information about that and how that could potentially be deployed in the future?
Thank you. Yes, certainly we're alive to the risks around external actors. I think you have covered that extremely well in terms of the potential risks. We're aware of those risks. We continue to raise those risks, and certainly in terms of our response to national security threats and terrorism and counter-terrorism more broadly, that's one of the key areas that concerns me, and something that we will continue to work hard to both prepare for and also respond to. I think you're right, that there are other rogue states, so to speak, that will utilise the tensions in Northern Ireland for their own means and create tension and try and create havoc in our local communities. So we're aware of that. We will respond to that, and we'll work with, as part of counter-terrorist policing, to try and manage and mitigate those risks.
I appreciate that. Not to cut across you, but just very quickly in the interest of time, obviously you've referred to mutual aid, and it's my understanding that mutual aid was made up of around 3 or 4 constabularies from across the UK, one of them potentially being in Scotland, where we know that there had also been attempts to stir up disturbance there. Do you think that was something that was done deliberately in order to frustrate the value of the mutual aid officers that were going to be going to Northern Ireland by attempting to spread them thinly on the ground in their own patch before they came over here?
Very quickly, Mr. Beck.
I've nothing to indicate that was planned as such, but I think what you'll see is attempts to stir it up right across the UK in response to any tensions or any trigger incident that may happen anywhere.
Thank you, Chair.
And then Claire Hannah.
Thank you very much. Davy, questions for you as well. We have heard that racially motivated crimes are at the highest level since records began. You also rightly raised the response from the voluntary sector, and that groups like ANACA did much of the heavy lifting in terms of supporting and housing some of the many people who were put out of their houses. Do you think there is the required seriousness at an executive level to address the race hate, the de-radicalisation, and I suppose even some of the legislation around racial motivation in crime in Northern Ireland? And I'll come back on the issue which you raised about paramilitary actors, but in terms of a cohesion strategy and a proactive response from the executive, are we at the races here?
Well, you're right in terms of your interpretation around the crime figures. So racially motivated hate crime in Northern Ireland is now at its highest level since we began recording, and it's trending upwards. And that raises a major concern for us, certainly in policing, and we've seen that over the last number of years with the disorder. Certainly when I look at the figures today, hate crime is up around 10%, but race crimes is up around 17%. So that rise in hate crimes is primarily driven by a rise in hate crimes. And we've seen that right across all areas of policing. So geographically, that spread, albeit the largest volume would be in the Greater Belfast area. So we're trending above the 5-year trend, and significant issues around criminal damage, arson being the most significant offences within the hate category. Sorry, the second point of your question there.
Is there adequate response in terms of a cohesion strategy from the executive?
In terms of response, certainly the feedback that I've got direct from communities is, I think, a degree of frustration that this is the 3rd year in a row that those communities have been the focus of significant disorder, tension, and violence. I think my experience has been that those communities are appreciative of the policing support and the policing response to those issues. But I think there is a feeling of frustration around a longer term strategy, a cohesive strategy across Northern Ireland to address those core issues of community cohesion. I think you're right in that.
You're correct about the frustration, and I absolutely acknowledge that on many other issues you are policing political failures. One of which is the failure to update race hate legislation that is outstanding for over 2 decades, and as you know, many of those representing minority ethnic communities are raising that. Does that prevent any challenge for you in policing terms and in prosecution terms, the absence of updated legislation about race hate motivation?
Well, I think we are falling behind the rest of the UK in terms of the legislation. We will make best use of whatever legislative frameworks there are, whatever offences they are, and I think you've seen that in terms of a response and the types of offences that we have investigated thus far. So we will continue to investigate, but I think you're right, from a policing perspective we are falling behind.
And finally, we don't have time to get into it at length, but you have raised the Chief Constable confirmation that paramilitary actors were involved in the disorder. You have also raised the reporting of checkpoints and healthcare workers being asked for ID from masked men who we presume were organised as well. Do you think there's an acceptance, a tolerance of a level of paramilitary involvement and violence and disorder and orchestration in Northern Ireland that's being allowed to persist?
Again, very quickly, Mr. Beck, so we can move on.
Well, I don't accept that from a policing perspective. I think you'll have seen the examples in terms of how hard we have worked to address the disorder, how hard we have worked in terms of the paramilitary crime task force to address paramilitary crime, and the work that we continue to do with communities to provide alternative ways and mechanisms to stabilise communities.
But you'll acknowledge, and I appreciate this isn't entirely a policing problem, right down from paramilitary emblems flying from lampposts all over my constituency and others, there is a tolerance of a level of paramilitary involvement in Northern Ireland that isn't one way or the other being properly addressed and eradicated.
I think that's fair, and I think that's indicative of that post-conflict society that unfortunately we still are very much in.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move on to migration topics, so it won't be quite so focused on you, Mr. Beck, and we'll bring in the rest of our panel. And I'm going to start with Belle Riviere, Eddy.
Thank you very much, Chair and panel. I do want to get into some questions about your roles and structures, but before I want to address the actual scale of the issue. So by the NISRA's own data, net migration into Northern Ireland was about 5,800 people in the year mid to 2024. And of everyone that came to live there, we've got 34% coming for work, 35% coming to join family, 14% for education and 10% to seek asylum. And asylum seekers overall make up 0.1% of the population. So given those figures, I wanted to ask you if you considered Northern Ireland to have a particular illegal migration crisis, and if so, what numbers were you working on?
Well, I can start this. I mean, I suppose the starting point for me has to be the absence of controls. Land controls means that we haven't actually got a comprehensive picture of what the actual migration issues are, irregular or regular. and that's why we work with National Crime Agency, we work with Home Office Intelligence, we work part of Border Security, we work with the Guard, and we work with the Irish or the Republic of Ireland authorities as well to try and enhance that picture. The agreement, I think, that we got in March with the Prime Minister and his counterpart in the Republic of Ireland to enhance the data picture, to improve biometric and asylum matching, to have a joint risk assessment is going to be fundamental to how we drive that forward. But I don't see any greater threat for Northern Ireland than I see. I mean, we look at the United Kingdom as a whole threat, and the CTA is not just a threat to Northern Ireland, it's a threat to all the United Kingdom as well.
And did anybody else on the panel have any points as to whether or not you think that there is a particular illegal migration crisis?
I wouldn't use the word crisis. It is obviously a concern, and certainly in our wider strategy for countering illegal migration, particularly that which is facilitated by organised immigration crime, Northern Ireland is a specific set of issues because of the CTA. But I mean, if you look at, say, asylum claiming from small boat entries last year, that was just over 41,000 out of a total of, I think, 90-something thousand that claimed. So the scale is greater, I think, in mainland UK. So I wouldn't characterise it as a crisis, but quite clearly from what Assistant Chief Constable said, there are real concerns about some of the the fallout from what is happening there.
Yeah, and I know we don't actually have a verified estimate of the undocumented population in Northern Ireland, presumably because it's so small, just like the number of migrants in Northern Ireland overall. But we do have some data for enforcement activity. So I think you had 1,284 arrests, over 900 of them were from Operation Gull, detections at ports and arrest measures, enforcement capacity, and not the underlying scale of, not necessarily the underlying scale of the problem. So I just want to ask if you have an evidence estimate of how many people in Northern Ireland were without lawful status, and if not, on what basis was such policy being built?
I think, again, the absence of controls means we're never going to have that unless we fundamentally change the CTA. I mean, we're
going to have some more questions on that shortly, by the way, so we're going to drill down into that a bit more. But yes, if you can...
Yeah, statistics around, I mean, 70% of all our activity in Northern Ireland is focused on Gull and tackling CTA abuse. Over the past 2 years, we've done 3,000 enforcement visits, the vast majority, again, to ports, airports, seaports, transport hubs around Northern Ireland. We've done over 2,500 arrests and removed 1,000 people. So, we do take the threat very seriously, and the vast majority of my resource is focused on tackling that threat.
Thank you. And I want to ask you all if you could summarise briefly what your respective roles were in addressing irregular migration in Northern Ireland. I'll start with you.
Yeah, so much as the wider role that I have, any kind of illegal migration into the United Kingdom is a concern of the Border Security Command. We are there to provide system leadership across government with agencies and partners. I have statutory authority through the Border Security and Asylum Act to be able to set priorities to all of those organisations which they have to have due regard to, and our job basically is to provide a coherence within that and set a strategy. So within that, obviously, abuse of small boats routes, clandestine routes, but particularly any abuse of CTA, both through Ireland into Northern Ireland or into mainland United Kingdom is a concern. So I have a role within that as part of my statutory role.
Thank you.
From an NCA perspective, the NCA's mission for Parliament is to protect communities from serious organised crime. So in this particular regard, our mission is to address those serious organised crime elements that are facilitating irregular migration, and much like Border Security Command, to ensure there's a shared awareness and common purpose in terms of an intelligence picture and action against serious organised crime in that regard. From regard to your previous question, from a SOC assessment perspective, whilst infrastructure and travel routes have increased to provide opportunity for organised crime groups coming into the common travel area, we haven't seen an increase in the serious organised crime threat over the same period emanating from the common travel area. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
And I think, without wanting to repeat what I said at the outset, my job is to use that intelligence and focus resource and deploy the teams to where that threat is greatest.
Okay. And how do you all work together? How do you coordinate effectively?
Very happily.
Sorry?
Very happily.
Very okay, that's easy enough. I want to turn to yourself again, Duncan, and ask what role specifically does Border Security Command play in addressing abuse of the CTA, and if the CTA forms part of the command's holistic strategy to secure UK borders.
Yeah, I'll come back from that. So the broader strategy that we have set is about stopping organised immigration crime facilitating illegal entry into the UK. So we move back from that. What we're trying to do, of course, initially is stabilise those countries where people are coming from. You'll be aware of some of the difficulties with that. We're trying to stop facilitation by those criminal gangs crossing borders illegally. And then when we come, obviously, into the near border area, we're trying to stop particularly facilitation in near border partners, Belgium principally, France, obviously, which you're aware. I know a lot of you have been out there. But particularly in those cases where people might be flying from those airports into either, Ireland and then crossing the border, or flying in directly and abusing that. We also try to deal with any of those pull factors, both in the mainland, of course, within Northern Ireland as well, particularly where criminal gangs try and abuse those migrants that do come in, because particularly with abuse of the CTA, it is unlike small boats, which is broadly is a relatively cheap model. The facilitators generally charge quite a lot of money to get people in through the common travel area. That then, as you're probably aware, leads to greater exploitation, particularly in the area of exploiting women, particularly in enslavement and human slavery. So that and the task force work that we do there is particularly part of that. With regard to the specific tactical responsibilities, that is the lead of National Crime Agency, Police Service and Northern Ireland Immigration Enforcement. They retain operational independence and their powers. My job is to set priorities and control the wider strategy.
And I suppose in presenting some of the data that I do have to yourselves and listening to your response, it seems like there isn't a lot of data in terms of what the scale of the crisis is. So I'm unsure about how you decide or how you share data between enforcement bodies to tackle irregular migration if there isn't that much data to begin with, and if you could outline what the barriers were to this.
Before you answer that, I know Paul Kohler has questions in a similar vein, so Paul, I don't know if you want to add your questions at this point.
Well, yes, it's really to try and get a feel for how you do establish the data. I understand the problems. Yeah. What are the techniques you use, and how confident are you in the data that you do have?
Let me start with, I know you asked one of the questions earlier. One of the things that is a good indicator, I think the number was 1,517 asylum, people seeking asylum who had come in to Northern Ireland last year. That number, whilst significant, is not anywhere near what was on the mainland. So that sort of gives us an idea broadly. As Eddy said, of course, for those people that enter in a clandestine way who we don't pick up and don't claim asylum, that is a more difficult figure. In terms of the sharing of intelligence, the intelligence picture is rich, and the organisations both, I'll let NCA talk for themselves, but both UK intelligence community, Home Office intelligence, which is part of Border Security Command, National Crime Agency and I work very closely together in terms of sharing that. I don't know if you want to cover some of what you do particularly.
Yeah, so to talk about how we do it, from an NCA perspective, we hold the pen on strategic assessment to give an overall picture of the threat, and in particular assessment on areas of threat like the common travel area, to build that shared awareness across system partners, and then to build a common purpose. We supplement any governance groups the Border Security Command or Immigration Enforcement PSNI can contribute to build that plan of what we're going to do together. In terms of a day-to-day collection, we use fusion centres that are staffed by our respective agencies, so they're co-located, they come together, they've got system access, and part of their job is to fuse into one picture what we can bring, and then disseminate that for action. So I suppose the other part of that, which I'll hand over to Eddy, is that from a crime agency perspective, we support immigration enforcement in their tactical actions, in their intensifications, with either a strategic or tactical intelligence picture if it's required, or any other covert support that they may need in order to effectively and efficiently execute their role. Thank you.
I mean, nothing major to add to that. I mean, immigration enforcement doesn't have its own intelligence function per se, but we're a key part of the intelligence cycle because we're on the ground undertaking the operations day in. So we feed our intelligence back, but we don't have our intelligence function. So we rely heavily on Border Security Command and NCA.
How confident are you that you know the size of the problem? How confident are you that what you know is correct?
It's extremely difficult to give a high degree of confidence in what is a clandestine area, but we do have confidence in the efficiency and effectiveness of the processes and systems that are in place. Just to add to that, I suppose that what the National Crime Agency's function is to do those things that as a government that are very specialist, very niche, and sometimes very expensive to do. So we do them once. So I do have a great degree of confidence in the service that we can provide system partners. But this, we shouldn't neglect the fact that this is a clandestine activity, which by its very nature, therefore, is done in the dark.
Mr. Capps, your predecessor told us at a previous session how nimble criminal gangs are exploiting different routes. If we are successful in addressing the channel, do you see the common travel area as a new source of potential problems?
Yes, and I know a number of you, you'll have interest in the small boat space, and you'll pick up that, as at today, we're 44% down on arrivals compared to last year, and 50% down on actual boats. So 50% fewer boats, the lowest number we've had since 2020.
Much bigger.
Very, very significant, and you'll be aware of some of the work that's gone in that space. I won't waste time here. But yes, displacement is a really big problem. As I know many of you are aware, these criminal gangs, they're very nimble, they're transnational, they're polycriminal, and it's a very lucrative business. You'd have seen earlier this year displacement into launches from Belgium. We had a launch right up onto very close to the Dutch border. We've managed broadly to shut that down, we hope, with the cooperation of our Belgian partners. And we are very worried about displacement into the CTA, particularly if there are new ferry routes coming on. I'll be aware there's a new ferry route that comes from Boulogne into Cork. I used to have responsibility when I was in Border Force for our European partners. We worked very closely with France on that. So it absolutely is the case, which is why, sort of to your question, making sure that our strategy, whilst prioritising small boats for now, because that is the highest, biggest volume and the greatest threat to life, is not myopically focused on that, because quite clearly if we do that, all we're doing is squeezing it into those other vectors. But as I mentioned earlier, we are unlikely, if we manage to bear properly down and make small boat crossings untenable, to see the same volume in other routes, because it just is because of the great work NCA and others do, very expensive, very difficult to do it. But that doesn't mean you can't have some high threat, high harm individuals that would try and exploit that route. Sorry, a very long answer to your question, but it's very absolute.
Wants to come in with Davy, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Just to come in on a couple of those points. So it was just to be clear, from a PSNI perspective, immigration control is not a PSNI function. Our role is very clearly around the prevention and detection of crime, primarily serious and organised crime and organised immigration crime that's linked to that cross-border movement. We also have a responsibility around safeguarding vulnerable people, so in essence victims of trafficking and modern slavery. We do have a role in terms of supporting our colleagues that are represented in the panel, and also in Garda Síochána in terms of that support and cooperation with our partners. And we do in essence provide that policing support where criminality intersects with the CTA. I suppose just to add my commentary in respect of a few of the questions, I think there are clear intelligence gaps. We recognise that, and we're working hard to try and fill those gaps, because from a policing perspective, our aim is to be absolutely intelligence-led in respect of our response to organised immigration crime. I think the scale of exploitation is increasing, and I think we've all commented on that. So it is, yes, an increasing problem, something we're aware of. How we deal with that, I think it's through that coordinated approach that has been talked about through Border Security Command, which I sit on as a representative for Northern Ireland, but also as part of our joint agency task force that I co-chair with the Deputy Commissioner of AGS, and all the key parties are represented at that body as well, which adds that coordination of operational activity to address that criminality.
Gavin Robinson.
Thanks very much, Chair, and good afternoon to you all. Duncan, I want to direct this to you, if that's okay. I mean, it seems to me the frailty of your posture, or the posture generally, is that a lot of the focus is on airports and seaports, and by very definition that means people are either illegally or irregularly within the United Kingdom until they ever come close to your detection. But you mentioned flights from Belgium or from Paris. How on earth can anybody board a flight in a Schengen area country and land in a non-Schengen area country, irrespective of the common travel area, without the appropriate passport or visa authorisation?
The answer is they shouldn't be able to.
So how is it happening? I mean, I'm curious about that. I think part of this discussion, we should be curious about that. How is it happening if we're talking to the Irish, because that's where they're landing, in Dublin, for example, or in Cork or Shannon? If we're talking to them, we're not curious to ask, how are people flying from non-CTA countries in the Schengen area to a non-Schengen area in the CTA country without ever being checked?
Yeah, I mean, I can't answer that question. It's not actually my expert area.
Does anyone on the panel have an answer to that?
No, that's it.
No, we deal with the serious organised crime elements of that. As part of that organised crime element, there is some facilitation of movement in the way you describe, using false documentation that is part of that threat.
Every citizen of our country is going to be busted over the next couple of weeks trying to make sure they have the right documentation, queue for hours, go through a process of making sure their holiday can be realised rather than rejected. And yet there seems to be, in my view, a lack of curiosity around this. We've heard CTA mentioned as an inhibitor. How is it that the guards in the Republic of Ireland are able to board trains and board buses regularly and routinely, pre and post Brexit, to check people coming into their country, and yet we don't do it at all within the United Kingdom?
Got a few more questions on this area as well, so perhaps I'll bring in Sir Alex Shelbrooke.
I'm fine, it's been answered.
It's been answered, okay, right. In that case, you could take on Mr Robinson's question.
The reason we can't do that in Northern Ireland is, I mean, I haven't got the powers to board buses. I just don't have those powers, so...
You could do it with the PSNI.
Sorry?
You could do it with the PSNI.
But then that'd be subject to relevant risk assessments and safety protocols for PSNI. I can't operate without PSNI.
You can't operate without PSNI?
I can't. I do not have the powers. My office don't have the powers just to stop buses and get on them.
So it's a power issue? It's nothing to do with CTA?
Personally, there's also the safety of my officers and where we do that. But first and foremost for myself, it's a power issue. I don't have that. Lawfully, I can't stop a bus that's travelling from Dublin to Belfast.
Have you ever considered a joint operation with PSNI?
I think at the moment, I mean, Dave might want to come in, but at the moment, as I said, we think from risk assessments, it's safer to do that, and we get better outcomes from at the ports, whether it's airports, ferry terminals, or train hubs.
Are you aware of people landing in Dublin and being told by Irish officials where to get the bus to Belfast so they can present themselves?
Anecdotally, I've heard that, yes.
You've heard that?
Yeah.
And yet, no joint operations, no curiosity about how people are able to land, and no discussions about how we close those avenues?
I think there's a lot of curiosity, and there is information sharing between the Garda and ourselves to target people. We prefer to target them at airports and ports as opposed to on the road.
Yes, once they might come close to Great Britain. Doesn't matter for how long they're in Northern Ireland. Accepted that, Chair.
Can I just ask about the entry-exit system? I mean, I went through Dublin at the beginning of this week, and I had to check my passport even though I was in the CTA. I did raise it with the Department for Foreign Affairs when I met them yesterday, but I just wondered how you saw entry-exit system affecting your work, if at all.
So I'd invite my colleagues from Border Force and Immigration Enforcement to make comment on that. Just to and I note that Davy's got his hand up in relation to that. In relation to the previous question from Mr. Robinson. From an NCA perspective, we support other partners like immigration enforcement, like Border Force, like PSNI, to police the common travel area in the environment that Northern Ireland presents in a post-conflict environment, and with regard to the community tensions that are apparent in those communities. But I feel perhaps Davy Mr. Beck may be able to answer that more.
You volunteered yourself.
Okay, it was just on Galvin's point around the stopping of vehicles. So my colleague is correct in that Border Force do not have the actual power to stop vehicles on a public road. So where there is intelligence and information that OIC suspects are involved in that movement, we have assisted in terms of operations and stopping those vehicles. We do not do that routinely because, as I said at the outset, our function is not to enforce immigration controls, but we do assist where there is intelligence-led operations and requests for that.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Chris Murray. We've got a few more questions on immigration, so I hope you'll indulge us for a little bit longer. But Chris Murray.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming in. In many ways, the Common Travel Area feels like a completely unique part of the UK-Ireland setup. But when you think about it, it's very similar to the Schengen area in Europe, where countries share their border controls and their border intelligence. So I'm just trying to get my head around what the challenges are that you face. So firstly, am I correct in thinking, just picking up on Mr. Robinson's point, if a third country national is in the European Union, in a Schengen country, say, and they travel to, say, Ireland, and then cross into Northern Ireland, into the UK, it is at the point where they travel from the Schengen area to Ireland that they will be checked on security systems as a threat, and whether or not they have a visa to enter Ireland. I understand that there will be some people who might get a visa to Ireland but who don't have one for the UK, but broadly speaking, it's at that point that a check takes place. Equally, if they move from the Schengen area into Northern Ireland, they will still be checked at that point, won't they?
When someone moves into Northern Ireland?
Yeah.
Checked by...
Is the point at which they move into the common travel area?
Yeah, this is so coming from Paris to Belfast or Paris to Dublin, you would expect there to be a check but only for non-EU nationals.
Yeah, yes, I think that's right, isn't it? Yeah.
So even though Ireland's outside Schengen, you don't get the check if you're an EU national on the entry-exit system.
So any non-EU national in the common travel area who has travelled by a regular route has been checked.
So so let's say you've boarded your plane from Paris, but you've come originally from Turkey, and you went to Belfast or Dublin, and I'm going to use that because they're both in the common travel area. I realise they're different jurisdictions, but they're both in common travel area. Will they both be checked at that point?
Either by...
Because that if they're coming through border controls, then yes, Border Force would check them. That's not...
So Paris into Belfast, checked. Paris into Dublin, would they be checked?
No, that's not my jurisdiction, sir.
I mean, that really is for... I mean, that's a European question, but they would have had to fulfil whatever the requirements for Southern Ireland were for their visa and requirements. If your question is then, do they get checked on the border coming from the south of Ireland to the north of the island?
That's not my question.
There is no check.
My question isn't if they get checked within the common travel area. My question is that any non-EU national entering the common travel area, whether that be by plane or by ferry, will be checked by either an Irish or a British border official.
Yes.
Yeah, so anyone within the common travel area, unless they entered irregularly, has been checked.
Yes.
So thank you, I just wanted to make sure I'd understood the clarification.
But isn't there a problem so your Turkish national boards in Paris and goes to Dublin, then travels to Belfast, and then leaves from Belfast back to Paris? They're not going to go through EES at that point?
No.
So we have a real problem with the contradiction between common travel area and EES.
They're European. That's the European Union.
Yes, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's the exit from the European Union won't be checked, but they would still, if they re-entered, would still be checked. Okay, so I want to just get that clear because I want to ask what the challenges are for enforcement bodies are in relation to the common travel area. in particular in relation to the land border, because obviously irregular immigration is a problem wherever it is, you know, whether you're entering Ireland, the UK, the common travel area, irregular immigration is illegal and shouldn't happen. But movement within the common travel area, how difficult, what are the challenges that you face in relation to the land border?
I mean, I think we've probably answered that question through that discussion. The challenge is not being able to physically check someone when they cross over from the Republic into Northern Ireland.
Have they been checked coming into the common travel area already?
It should have been.
Yeah, they should. The non-EU nationals we talk about.
Yeah. Okay, so it's EU nationals the challenge.
No, but I mean, I think people still travel. They still travel from Republic of Ireland to Belfast on the bus, even if they've been checked, don't they? So.
Yeah. We do.
Okay. So what does intelligence-led checks mean on, what's the difference between intelligence-led checks for non-EU nationals versus EU nationals?
Okay, I mean, I can talk generally about the intelligence picture, but this is around understanding where we see the most abusive routes, and that's breaking it down by, as you say, the nationalities, the routes they're coming in. And I said this isn't restricted solely to Northern Ireland. I said there are routes over in mainland UK as well, where we target operations as well. And being able to focus that resource about where we see or where we believe the intelligence suggests the most abuse is.
So to add to that and to refer to your earlier question, the common travel area is there to facilitate and enable free movement, and that's a vulnerability that is exploited by organised crime groups. That's a challenge, and having a balanced and proportionate response to that is a challenge. So our role in terms of trying to counteract that challenge and address it is to provide a strategic and tactical intelligence picture to immigration enforcement and system partners, and work with PSNI and Border Force Immigration to collate an intelligence picture and to point to trends and changes in how organised crime is facilitating and abusing that vulnerability.
Thank you, and so I get that. So what I'm trying to drive at is whether an intelligence-led model of that differs when those organised crime groups or those people you're trying to target are from an EU background or a non-EU background or non-British background as well.
I would say from our perspective it's a vulnerability that is exploited, whether that's from an EU or a non-EU background, whether it's in relation to serious organised crime or indeed any other crime. So our approach is to look at the vulnerability, assess that vulnerability, and support partners in putting in their own plans in order to address that according to their missions and their duties.
Okay, so the fact that so just to go back to my earlier point, and apologies this is confusing, but just to go back to my earlier point, non-EU nationals are all checked when they enter the common travel area. EU nationals aren't. But what you're saying to me is, doesn't actually make that big a difference that non-EU nationals are checked and EU nationals aren't checked when they come into the common travel area, because you find that, and I'm not putting words in your mouth here, I'm trying to interpret what you're saying, you find that it doesn't make a difference because some intelligence tells you to pursue one and some intelligence pursues you to another. It doesn't add anything for you.
What I'm saying is that we approach the vulnerability that the common travel area presents from a threat, risk and harm perspective. So we look at how that vulnerability is exploited by organised crime. So for example, EU citizens may exploit that CTA for drug trafficking purposes from, for example, Romania through Europe into Ireland and then into Northern Ireland and GB from there. Our intelligence collection in relation to that and our sharing of intelligence with partners will be much the same as where we look at organised crime groups that are facilitating families from Afghanistan or Iraq through that common travel area and into GB from Northern Ireland.
I'm going to bring in Katrina Murray because she's got specific questions on organised immigration crime. Then I've got Robin Swan on cooperation with the Republic of Ireland. And Paul, do you need to come in on anything further? You can.
Just one very quick one.
Okay, let's do Katrina and Robin, then we'll go back to you, Paul.
Particularly Mr Bonfield, how significant is the role of organised immigration crime groups in Northern Ireland in facilitating unauthorised migration through the common travel area?
So that's very difficult to give a definitive answer because we have a fragmentary picture. I think when we zoom out, Duncan and I have already talked about the overall threat to the UK, and so organised crime plays a significant role in facilitating irregular migration, but there is still a large part of irregular migration that is not facilitated, does not require to be facilitated by organised crime. Does that answer your question, ma'am?
One of the things that I think we are, certainly from the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee perspective, is that we are particularly concerned about is the differences between the organised crime, immigration crime within the Northern Ireland Common Travel Agency as opposed to the Channel crossing, and particularly do we know of where there's paramilitary links, whether it's Republican or Loyalist groups, are different tactics being used to tackle them, or it might be that wider picture where actually is this slightly different or is this exactly the same?
So just on the point of the response to paramilitary organised crime, PSNI lead on the system response to that. From an NCA perspective, we don't see reporting of paramilitary involvement in organised crime. That's not something that we see. There are the way I would characterise the common travel area abuse is that, as I say, that is a vulnerability that is exploited by serious organised crime, much the same as other vulnerabilities on the UK border are exploited by serious organised crime. So in that instance, it is very much the same. The difference is the difference that we've pulled out already in our answers around the challenge of operating in an area where there are still community sensitivities and where there is an absence of data to collect.
Mr. Capps, has the establishment of the Border Security Command made any difference to efforts to disrupt organised immigration crime groups within Northern Ireland?
I'll have to defer to Miles. I mean, I think more broadly, we split the strategy into three geographical and thematic areas. One of them, of course, is reducing the pull factors, what is making the UK attractive for people that want to come here. That includes the criminal gangs that want to exploit migrants and their hope of a better life to come and get involved. You know, illicit activity and criminality, which I know is what you're getting at, and in the UK that is quite a significant pull factor, which is why you'll have seen the Home Secretary's efforts to drive down on those, and also what we're trying to do to break that up using our domestic task force, of which Northern Ireland is a big part of that, but it's also the work we do in the continent with partners. I think it's having a broader effect because we've put a lot of resource into that. We now have under Wendy Gunny the domestic task force that works with police services in Northern Ireland and partners to try and drive down that criminality and try and reduce the pull factors. So my hope is as we pick up momentum, and of course we're only 2 years old now, and the money is now coming as part of that programme into those organisations, we'll see an increased bearing down on that, particularly into breaking up those gangs and where they operate. Because most of what you'll get with immigration crime, it happens on other sovereign territories. We have to deal with partners. What happens, of course, within the United Kingdom, we have home advantage and we can drill in using our police service and National Crime Agency.
Mr. Beck, you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you. It's just again to pick up on Katrina's point. So I suppose my assessment would be that organised immigration crime is increasing, and I think that's indicative of the increase on direct ferry travel from mainland Europe into Ireland. I think that ferry traffic is up about a third. So I think there is more opportunity as a consequence of that for organised criminal groups to exploit that increased traffic flow. That's something we are aware of. For me, Border Security Command gave me the opportunity to link in with Duncan and the national picture and ensure that the CTA element is considered. It also gives me the opportunity to link in with the domestic task force and have that linkage and connectivity across law enforcement right across the UK, and also then extending that with our partners in AGS through to that collaboration, information sharing, knowledge and awareness with AGS as well. And we are involved in our organisational response through a number of operations, including Operation Fusion, which in essence is our primary response to organised immigration crime. And there's been significant disruptions, seizures, arrests over the last number of years linked to our detections in that regard.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Davy.
Robin Swan.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, folks, for what you've said so far. Can I just ask, in regards to, I suppose, the bigger picture picked up by other questions, how strong is the cross-border cooperation between yourselves and similar Irish authorities, especially in regards to irregular or illegal migration?
Yeah, I'll start off if I may. Davy Beck made reference to the Joint Emergency Task Force with AGS that he co-chairs. That's a really good structure which brings a strategic level together, a tactical level as well. There's really good cooperation and strength in that.
I was going to say, so Minister Callaghan attended the Border Security Command's Organised Immigration Crime Summit last year. He took appointment, I think, in the February. He came to that in the May. That was very good in terms of promoting wider cooperation. You know, the Prime Minister has met TSOC. We don't just cooperate on organised immigration crime. We because of course they're polycriminality. A lot of those organisations are involved in drugs. I happen to have the maritime responsibility as well. We do a lot with them, particularly on drugs coming out of Central America, particularly the at-sea drop-off piece. So that cooperation is really strong, and it spans not just organised immigration crime, it's also drugs and other high harms.
And I'd just point to the reference earlier to the UK Ireland summit from March with the Prime Minister and his counterpart, reinforcing the need to data sharing, the various elements of that that underpin that.
Mr. Beck.
Yeah, and again, just to add in quickly, I've mentioned Joint Agency Task Force. We also have a refreshed cross-border strategy, which was refreshed in 2025, which runs to 2027. So that north-south cooperation, collaboration, information sharing, I'd say is as strong as it's ever been, if not stronger. East and West, we're well connected in through my office to Border Security Command, our regional organised crime units and counter-terrorism policing, all of which I sit on a range of boards that ensures that East-West collaboration and coordination as well.
Okay, so meetings, visits, strategies, what's the output? How many arrests, how many prosecutions from the cross-border working with your colleagues in the Republic?
Well, again, from a policing perspective, significant operational outcomes in respect of that. If I look at Op Fusion alone, over the last 3 years, within the region of 165 disruptions, in the region of 1.4 million pounds worth of cash seized, over 24 million pounds worth of drugs
Sorry,
seized.
David, sorry, in regards to immigration?
Well, immigration crime, that would be, from my perspective, Robin. Immigration, I think my colleagues would have to comment on that.
I mean, specifically for organised immigration or criminals related to organised immigration crime, we've arrested 250 in the past year.
At what point geographically?
That would have been in Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland, okay. In regards to, I think Mr. Capps and Mr. Beck both referred to increased ferries. I think Mr. Capps, you Boulogne to Cork, I think was the route was mentioned, increased by a third. What additionality is there working with the Irish authorities in regards to that increased ferry travel?
I mean, I'll start, Davy. I mean, so of course you've got issues where so ferries, of course, cheaper to cross on than airports and air, potentially easier to board. We had, for example, on the one in, one out deal, we had one stowaway on the ferry that went across Cork. We picked up there, so we knew that people were trying to return via that way. We've worked quite hard with the French authorities, particularly on port security in Boulogne. We've worked, of course, with Ireland now on the security in the Boulogne ferry, on the Cork end of that ferry, to make sure that we've got the right cooperation in there. But it is a concern because any routes that you've got that potentially are open to, illicit stowing away or coming in with false false documentation mean that you've got a greater volume, and obviously it's obvious you can get a greater volume of people onto a ferry than you can onto an aircraft. So it's one of those ones that we have got concerns about.
Sorry, you said you work with the Irish authorities in Cork, so do you have a presence in Cork?
Yes.
We do have a physical
We have a liaison
presence.
officer that's based from Border Force in Cork.
Okay. So in regards then to those operational challenges, do you have any, I suppose, challenges working with the Irish authorities on enforcement activity that you think we could help resolve?
I can't really, not that I'm not going to comment, I can't really comment. That would probably have to be one for Border Force to have that conversation with. But I think the cooperation of the committee in terms of keeping the dialogue going and the sport piece would be very helpful, if that's the question.
And then in regards to data sharing, it was covered earlier on, is there adequate data sharing between your authorities and the Irish authorities in regards to numbers, routes, travels, number of people coming in?
I sense that's an improving picture. I don't know, Eddie?
So yeah, I mean, I think starting from probably 4 years ago, it wasn't great, but things have improved steadily. The relationships improved steadily. I think the commitment and desire to work together collaboratively has improved. We're not there yet, but I think, as I say, the commitment that's been given by the leaders of both countries means that we're all working towards the same thing now.
4 years in?
I said, well, now I was going back to when I started doing this 4 years ago. That was my base point. I wouldn't say that.
But it hasn't actually...
It has improved. Yeah, no, it has improved massively.
The relationships have improved, or data sharing has improved?
Both. Massively.
And could it improve further?
I think that's what we're working towards, yeah.
So from a sort of perspective in that area, the sharing of tactical and strategic intelligence has improved. The commitment to use constructs like Europol to provide a common picture with the Irish authorities, that's improved. It's part of the UK Ireland security talks to take those elements further and to go harder on some of those data sharing elements in as far as we can.
And are extradition arrangements working between Ireland and?
Davy's got his hand up, so I'll defer to him.
Davy.
Yes, cooperation more generally, I would say, is really positive and works really well. Clearly, there are some limitations and time issues in respect of MLATs, etc., that do take some time, but operationally they're very swift and good information sharing and intelligence sharing. Probably the one area, just to touch on Robin's question, we don't have immediate access to biometric data from a crime perspective because Ireland are not aligned to the PRUM sort of biometric sharing processes. That's something that we have raised with our colleagues in AGS, and they're acutely aware of as well. It's probably one of the key gaps, I would suggest, and it's something again we are attempting to address through the intergovernmental agreement in terms of opportunities to try and close down those gaps.
And how big a difference would that make, Davy, if that was completed?
Well, I think that would speed up identification when there is suspicions around the organised criminality aspect, that you would have that access to biometrics within a relatively short space of time, as opposed to having to go through the longer processes of applications through Europol, etc.
And extradition's working, Davy?
Yes.
Okay. And ministers, at North-South ministers, are they both involved and they are cited on this?
Yes.
My understanding, yes.
Okay, thank you. Paul Kohler to complete this session, and then we'll move on.
Mr. Beck, from the PSNI's perspective, are irregular migration and organised immigration crime in Northern Ireland given sufficient priority by the Home Office?
I think they are, would be my initial answer. I suppose again, as our role in terms of PSNI, can I devote significant resources to it that it warrants? Probably I struggle to devote the resources to organised immigration crime that I should. simply because of the constraints and the competing pressures and priorities across Northern Ireland. In terms of Home Office, I think the Border Security Command, our cooperation with NCA and Home Office is again really good, positive, and I think there's an evolving recognition around the CTA, the complexities of the CTA, the impacts around CTA more generally on citizens, north and south. So I think for me, it's a strategic response around that information sharing, intelligence, and the targeted interventions that I think there is an increasing awareness and response to, if that answers your question.
Mr. Montgomery, what's your view on whether or not the Home Office gives sufficient priority to illegal immigration, irregular immigration and organised crime in Northern Ireland?
I think absolutely, and I think there's been a commitment from the Home Secretary to invest further into immigration enforcement, which will see a disproportionate uplift in resource coming into Northern Ireland to tackle CTA and immigration enforcement over the next 2 to 3 years. So we will be uplifting resource considerably.
At the moment, there's 5,000 immigration enforcement officers employed in the UK. There's 57 in Northern Ireland. Does that sound like a lot of resource?
I dispute those figures. I think 57 immigration officers in immigration enforcement or border force or...
Immigration enforcement officers, that's the figures we have.
Yeah, but they're not the totality of our response to CTA, because I have crime teams.
It's an indicator. There's 5,000 in the UK and only 57 in Northern Ireland. Isn't that an indication of how resource is being utilised?
But we deploy our resource to threat, and as I said, we're uplifting our resource by 25% over the next 12 months. And also, I deploy resource across the whole of the United Kingdom to tackle CTA, so other routes and ports as well. So the totality of immigration enforcement's response is not just focused on what I deploy in Northern Ireland.
Okay, if there's no further points from you that you wish to make as witnesses, is there anything else you wish to say? In that case, I will bring this part of the session to a conclusion. We'll move on to a panel with ministers in a few minutes, but I think the line is we'll use a couple of minutes to let the front benches clear and change over, and I'll suspend for now. Order.
This is panel 2, our ministerial session between the Home Affairs Committee and the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee on policing and disorder and community cohesion. Minister Patrick, what has been your response to the disorder seen in Northern Ireland in the last month, and has the UK government provided the PSNI and other organisations with adequate support?
I was horrified by the disorder, like I think everyone in this room that saw that. I think the Secretary of State has been unbelievably clear that when you see people being burnt out of their homes because of the colour of their skin, it can be called nothing but pure out and out racism. And I think there's been real moral clarity. The Secretary of State has led that, but I think right across the spectrum people have come out and condemned that, and rightly so. So I was totally appalled by what we saw. I was so grateful to security services and to community services too for their response. I think I said this at the time. I really worried that the world's eyes were looking at Northern Ireland and saw, frankly, a small proportion acting in a way that brought Northern Ireland to one of its lowest moments in recent years. And actually for me, that is nothing like the Northern Ireland that I see, and I'm sure, Chair, that you see every single day. And I'm horrified that that might be an impression that people across the world take, that tourists who are thinking of where to go might think that that is the norm, or that a business that's thinking of where to invest or locate international staff might look at that and think twice. And so I was appalled. I think it was deeply self-destructive. I think the thugs that went out to cause disorder and to undertake that abhorrent racism did nothing but deep damage to people in Northern Ireland. And you ask about UK government support for the institutions. Now, you'll note that we secured an additional £4 million uplift for the PSNI, which I think is really important, not least because of the costs of overtime and mutual aid, which we were really keen to step in and support. And you will know, we rehearsed it just last week at the committee, that this is on top of a record settlement for a devolved executive in Northern Ireland. So it obviously is in their gift to set those fundings, whether it's for the police or community services, at a high level. But we wanted to step in that moment, we did.
I mean, going on the £4 million, I mean, we just heard Assistant Chief Constable Davy Beck say about the true cost at the moment is standing at 5.4 million, and they are still, and it's a growing amount of money. Obviously, there were 168 officers that arrived within 24 hours of what happened, the disorder, and that mutual aid was very much needed and was swifter. But this is a third year in a row, Minister, that disorder has broken out in Northern Ireland. They are getting better at dealing with it, and they do not have enough money. They are not adequately resourced to deal with events like this. So what else can the government do?
One of the things the government can do is work closely with the executive to support them in a process to set a budget, because I mentioned to the committee that a record settlement, more than ever before in the history of devolution, has been given to the executive, and it is in their gift. Clearly, funding for the police is a devolved matter outside of the additional security funding that we put in directly. And so one of the things we can do to support that is support those component parts of the executive to come together and set a budget. Now, we were in talks just last week trying to make progress on that, and I think that's about recognising our commitment to making progress on this issue so that the PSNI can solve funding issues.
What happens next year if it happens again?
You mentioned rightly, right, that 3 years in a row now disorder has broken out in Northern Ireland. I'm sure Minister Norris will tell me that the same will have been true for England, Wales and Scotland in different parts in terms of a spike in activity at different points. We've got to get to a place where what we don't want is our police to be in a situation where they are unable to cope with an unexpected incident. Our police are there clearly to keep all of us safe, and we want our police to be in a situation where an incident like this is something they can meet. Now, they did, and they met it tremendously, but not without real difficulty, and I accept that. I think that's why we were successful in securing £4 million extra money for the police.
And one of the things that we've spoken about at committee is the impact that cuts on youth outreach programmes, community outreach programmes, as part of the implementation of the Local Growth Fund has had. Now, these groups are key to keeping communities together. The Local Growth Fund, as actually we heard in committee last week, has meant that not being there for them has actually meant that these people are now unpaid. And they went out of their own bat as volunteers to support these communities. But if they were there continuously, and had they been there continuously, monitoring the situation, then they were doing the job. They've had to have the police to go in to do that now. And the problem is that has wider consequences for social cohesion. What can we do, Minister? Because it's just not sustainable.
Well, as I mentioned to the committee last week, in relation to the Local Growth Fund, I'm never going to sit before this committee and have anything other than praise for those groups that do tremendous work. They have powerful advocates in this committee and in others, and I hear that loudly and clearly. I've sat across the room from these very people as well. I've heard about the great work they do. We've been clear that funding split can't change, won't change. We've also been clear, though, that doesn't mean that we say tough. It's not the case that we say, but the executive, since this issue has arisen, has received more than £300 million in additional funding, and they can fund this. We could say that, but we don't. We have taken it upon ourselves, myself and the Secretary of State, sat down with these groups, sat down with the Peace Plus programme, something else that the UK government funds to the tune of hundreds of millions of pounds, to try and be creative, because I think in the modern age, that's what you expect of us, right? Which is, it's not good enough to say, well, there's something over there, good luck. I want to affect change. So that's why I've made sure that we brought people together and did everything that we could to find a creative approach to securing funding for these people. And applications have gone in, as you know.
Yeah, and you talked about Peace Plus. I was just wondering, I mean, has the Irish government provided any funding in response to the disorder in Northern Ireland?
I'm not sure about that. I know there's I think that you had mentioned previously there might have been some funding. Is that correct, Chair?
I was just wanting to find out if you did know anything about
but that. I hadn't heard about that, so I'm very happy to find out more. But I wondered, because it was part of my briefing pack, I wondered if there's any details you have about that.
I don't. I was just trying to find out if it was true.
Okay, well, if anyone has any details, I'm very happy to try and find that out.
Okay.
But it's not something to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you very much. David Smith.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, panel. About 2004-2005, I was living in Belfast, and there was a bit of a spike in anti-immigration rhetoric and attacks in some houses, especially in the Holy Lands area of Belfast. And so I and a few friends decided to go around leafleting pre-politics and just put little cards saying welcome to people all around the area. So really, really saddened to see in the recent reconciliation inquiry that we're doing in the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee that we've reached an all-time high since records began that year. Coincidentally, that I was going round with some friends putting in those postcards. And a simple question really is to either Minister Patrick, Minister Norris, does the government recognise that trend and that direction of travel in terms of racially aggravated and motivated crimes in particular? And if so, first question is what can you do about it?
Well, if I can start with that. It would be hard not to recognise that, right? You, Mr. Smith, went and noticed this as a concerning thing 21 years ago, and I think we saw a significant uplift. Obviously, I mentioned the racism that we saw on the streets of Belfast just a few weeks ago. We've seen an uplift, therefore, in reporting. I think it is a challenge for all of us, and I actually think your opening demonstrates perfectly this issue. I've long believed that the capacity of any governments working collectively, collaboratively, and at their very best day is about this big, and it's about a tenth of the size of the problems facing any country. And if we are only waiting on government to solve those problems, we will wait a very long time. And that is not to diminish for a second the effort being made right across government. It's just a recognition of that fact. So the fact that you, Mr. Smith, were out there 21 years ago doing those leaflets, I think is part of the answer to this. The community groups that I've got to sit down with pre the disorder recently in Belfast, and also post, are part of the solution to this. The police who I've sat down with, who themselves have faced terrible difficulty just before this with some attacks at stations. I was speaking to some officers at Montgomery. They are clearly part of the solution to this as well. And so I think that is concerning. I think we can all see the uptick and the abuse and the kind of coarseness of that nature and the racism that comes with a lot of that. And I think it worries us. And so from government side, so I say it's everyone's got to do their bit. What's government's doing, and Minister Norris I'm sure will add, but what we're doing is there's money, a record settlement to go into the executive. Now, you look at the issues, how do you tackle something like this hatred that we see? It's a whole of society approach. You need the enforcement part. Where you can, you need prevention. I'm Jewish, and I talk a lot about anti-Semitism and how we might solve it. And it's not the most romantic of answers, but sometimes getting to a place where people aren't angry and looking for someone to blame is part of the solution. And so it's a whole of society approach. And that's something I think government really recognises.
Yeah, I mean, to build on that point, Mr. Smith, I mean, because this is something we would recognise across the UK as a growing trend. And we heard in the previous panel from Assistant Chief Constable Beck that he was seeing trends around hate and racism increasing on his beat, and that would be the same that my Chief Constable would say to me and the same that Chief Constables would say across the country. Through our Protecting What Matters strategy as a government, that's something that obviously is led in other parts of government, but all departments have a stake in. It's about making that all society change. I'm conscious the thing we do at the moment, and we can do effectively actually, but isn't, I don't think, the final destination for this is where we have disorder, like we've seen in the summer 2024, like we've seen that the abhorrence that Matt talks about, that we're good in response to saying, all right, we need to get some money into the field, we need to power up civil society organisations to help, take that agency and build on what they're doing, put more on to try and de-escalate. Well, maybe we're giving ourselves the answer a little bit there. So through that Protecting What Matters, we're trying to get on the front foot. And that is something that we as a Home Office have a significant part in, because it links to policing. There is a question too, I mean, I'd want to be abundantly clear for the panel. Those who spread hate, those who are racist, that is their fault. That's, that there is no justifiable, there is nothing that a justifiable response to it is racism. We know, and I've had this conversation with members of the Home Affairs Select Committee that are here today, the impact of, and Matt finished by talking about anger and our role as a government in trying to reduce some of that anger and division in society. Well, a disordered an uncontrolled asylum system, which is what we inherited and what we're fixing, that's part of that anger as well. And as we demonstrate, I strongly believe this in my own community, as we demonstrate order and control of the system, we will see anger dissipate. And that too is part of living in a world where there is less division, there's less desire to find someone to put a blame on, fewer people able to find a market for peddling that mis and disinformation that was talked about by the panellists as well.
Thank you. You've begun to answer Minister Norris there, the follow-up question, and I'll just give Minister Patrick an opportunity maybe to add to what you've said, because clearly, as you said, there's a limited role for government. It's an all-society issue when we think about how do we live in socially cohesive communities, but there is a role for government, and one of the roles is a sort of analysis of the problem, taking one step back and looking at the horizon level and saying, okay, how have we gone from that 2004 when community relations meant a different thing in Northern Ireland. It still means what it meant then, but it's grown in lots of ways. Is there anything you'd add from a sort of analysis, structural assessment of why we're seeing in Northern Ireland particularly these trends over time of increased breaking down of social cohesion, but especially increased sort of racial aggravated crime and so on?
I'd be interested to know whether that is very specific to Northern Ireland. I think we've both spoken about hate that's peddled. There is a market, a very lucrative market, in peddling hate, division and anger. You see that on social media. You see how people construct accounts entirely about pumping out videos that are going to make you angry. and are going to distort the truth, and they are very successful at that, and they are very lucrative business models. Part of the way you solve this is the moral clarity that I think we have seen from people on the back of the recent disorder in Belfast. I think coming out quickly and calling it for what it is, which is racist thuggery, is actually really important. Some of the work we've done during that disorder as well to kind of get messages out there, which is go home, don't take part in this, is also really important. It's obviously a worrying trend, but I think, look, you can look back throughout history, and I suspect whenever you see a time where the state hasn't been feeling as prosperous as it could have done for years and years and years, this sentiment rises. But I don't think the answer can simply be, oh, we grow the economy, it'll be fine, right? Is that part of the answer? Of course it is. But as Minister Norris says, growing the economy but not looking like you've got control of the issues that people care about is a recipe for anger. And anger finds a way to find someone to be angry at. And we have a real duty to bring about the conditions that mean there's less anger, but we also have a duty to make sure that where we see that anger, where we see it directed at people based on the colour of their skin, we are unequivocal in condemning it and challenging it and standing up to it.
Final question, Chair. There is a particular dimension to Northern Ireland, this for anybody on the panel, which is paramilitarism. I was going to ask in a sort of roundabout way, but let me just make a statement and say paramilitarism is involved in disorder in Northern Ireland and was involved in the horrendous scenes that we saw, it seems to me, back recently in North Belfast and elsewhere. And here we are, again, sort of 20 years on from the work that I was doing in Belfast there. What more can we do to tackle paramilitarism? Because it's not a lot of the protests, a lot of the disorder we saw, the disgusting disorder, is not organic. It's not just bubbling up. I'm sure there is some element there, but there's very much coordinated efforts there. And yet here we are, coming up for 30 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, and paramilitarism still is an insidious threat to social cohesion in Northern Ireland, and as we've seen in this session, involved in organised immigration crime. What more can we do to tackle that, and how are we going to really, once and for all, deal with it?
So, paramilitarism was never justified, ever, and it's not today. I think it's really important you spoke about 21 years ago. I think it's really important to note the huge progress made in the last 28 years since the Good Friday Agreement. Enormous strides taken forward. But that does not mean that there aren't people, relics of paramilitarism now dressed up in, organised crime now, does not mean that there are not people who have holds over some communities and cause them intense damage. These are not people actually, they might state they're looking out for a community or an area, but they are the people who bring harm to that community and to that area and to all of us. And that's why it's a duty on all of us to stand up to it. We are supporting this executive programme on paramilitarism and organised crime. We support that with funding. It's really important that we do that. It's also important, I think there's a range of things that programme does, from supporting the police in some of their works to some diversionary tactics, to understanding why people are going into that path as well. It is obviously a concern, and it's one we take seriously and one we support those institutions across Northern Ireland to tackle.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'll pass back to the Chair.
Thank you very much. Paul Kohler.
Thank you, Chair. Minister Norris, how concerned are you about evidence of abuse of the common travel area in fuelling irregular immigration and the crime associated with it?
It is a significant concern to me. Protecting our borders is a primary concern for the government. Any abuse of that is something we find unacceptable. You made a really, really important point in the previous session that what we see from organised immigration criminals, highly sophisticated, highly cynical individuals, is that they will seek to exploit whatever vulnerabilities they think. And as you make changes in certain parts of the system, you have displacement activity. So I start with a base level of concern around the CTA itself. You heard from Mr. Capps' evidence that comparative to whether it's small boats crossings, comparatively to those who overstay or abuse the legal visa system, it is much smaller. Nevertheless, as we drive changes in the channel, and there is no doubt the model is changing the channel in terms of the launch points, in terms of the size and nature of the boats, in terms of the pressure on engines of boats, you are going to see a displacive activity. Our concern in there is that the CTA is an obvious place for displacement. That's a conversation I've had with Government Island, as we have across government, and I've had with the executive as well. So of course that's something that's of great significance to us.
Have you made any proposals, any changes recently? What's happened?
Yes, we're increasing, we're making a 20% uplift in our enforcement capacity. You will have heard again from Mr Montgomery's evidence that the end state for this over the course of this Parliament will mean that we've doubled the amount of money we've put into immigration enforcement. That is skewed as a percentage terms to Northern Ireland to reflect that growing challenge. So that's, that's our response to that possible risk.
And is it just resources? Are you changing in processes, immigration enforcement checks?
So, I mean, because again, this is a hugely important question, because it isn't simply a case of resourcing. The resourcing, I would argue, is very, very important. Our border, we talk about our border in the singular, but our border in its nature is multiple. And with regards to this session, we are talking about a common travel area where there are not regular immigration controls at that border. Similarly, we have other parts of the UK, including on the other side, as it were, of Northern Ireland, we have sea borders. They are enforced in a different way as you would do to a land border in a free travel arrangement. And then we have ports, and ports again are enforced in a different way to how we enforce our sea borders. So our approach is a pragmatic one that's based on the nature of the border. In this case, our best way, without regular immigration controls, as Eddy alluded to in the previous panel, is to take an intelligence-led approach to find where people are seeking to abuse that free travel across the border, and in that way to protect that border and to dissuade people from trying to exploit it.
There was a joint risk assessment undertaken by the Home Office and the Republic of Ireland on the common travel area. What's emerged from that?
Well, it very much in line with what we said. We know that, and I think it's really important that we don't merely focus on organised immigration crime. These are polycriminals in many cases, but also the vulnerability exists for other things, be it drugs, be it guns, be it counterfeit products, and the likes, as well as the trafficking in human beings. So that kind of joint assessment is that is a live risk where you don't have kind of regularised routine immigration controls. Similarly, our joint picture, and again, this hasn't been a part of these discussions yet, but I would encourage colleagues to hold this in their head. Our start for our approach here should not be at that border. Actually, it is a shared goal for us to police the entirety of the Republic of Ireland's borders too, and we've got a lot of equity in that because of the channel. So that if there are drug drops or similar, we're working in a really united and kind of common fashion there. I think the shared picture as well would be that we are not, and again, this was a feature of the previous panel, at our end state for data. And there are things more that we collectively want. And, through the agreements that PM and the Taoiseach made in the springtime, we're now working through that to see, what a maximalist picture could be for data, because that, again, is a common and shared good.
Is there more to be achieved in that coordination between the UK and the Republic of Ireland?
Yes, that never reaches an end state, not least because the threat changes. As I say, the number one thing, if I could change something in the room today, would be the data piece. Now, I have to say that isn't specific to the Republic of Ireland. That's also true for France, Germany, Belgium. In fact, the entirety of the EU, in fact, frankly, the entirety of the world, but particularly EU neighbours. We are working through the UK-EU summit process to work on, within kind of third country arrangements, better access to data. I've spoke when I was in front of the committee a number of weeks ago about the data checks we do at Manston, our international databases. I would always want more there, because the more we do that, the kind of stronger we can make sure that people aren't, whether it's claiming in both and seeking support on both sides of the borders, or indeed in other countries, or have rejected asylum applications. And at the moment, we're not at that end state, and that's what we're working on.
Okay, Gavin Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. Alex, who do you believe is responsible for protecting, policing the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic?
The border is the responsibility of the UK government, and within that's responsibilities the Home Office, and within that is the responsibility of the Home Secretary, and within that's my responsibility as Minister for Border Security and Asylum.
And so within that, we've just had a panel with a myriad of individuals giving evidence, and Border Force say there are issues that are for PSNI, and PSNI say there are issues for Border Force, and NCA say they're happy to work with anybody as long as they're in partnership. But there wasn't a sense of cohesion. There was no sense of cohesion, so I'm asking you, as Minister, self-identified, responsible within the Home Office, how are you going to bring that cohesion about?
Well, I mean, first of all, I wouldn't agree with that characterisation. I would point to, in my previous answer, the nature of enforcing and protecting a border looks different in different contexts, and therefore has different challenges and different vulnerabilities. At one of our borders, one of the great challenges is that we are interdicting boats 10 miles away from our coast. That's a very challenging environment. Duncan's team do an extraordinary job in keeping people safe in that regard. So we have to have a context-specific approach. I would say to you, Mr. Robinson, I'd say to all the panel, assess us on the results there. And again, what Eddy talked about in terms of the degrees of operations, nearly 3,000 visits, 2,400 arrests, 1,000 people returned, 500 people returned to the Republic of Ireland. That is significant intervention. Do we want to make sure always there is the right operational interaction? Absolutely we do. Does that change because the smugglers or organised criminals try and test that? Absolutely it does. And we would change within that and do whatever we have to do within that. But I believe the approach is coherent, and my evidence for that is the results that it puts on the table.
Just with the Chair's indulgence, I asked Mr. Montgomery a question, and it was based on the focus of enforcement being at our airports and seaports. And clearly that means that there's an understanding there are people within the United Kingdom, but within the Northern Irish part of it. And I asked him, are you only concerned whenever people are going to move from one part of the United Kingdom to Great Britain? And he agreed. He accepted that. And so my question to you is whether that is position of government, and whether your concern isn't actually whether people are in the United Kingdom illegally or irregularly, it's that they dare come across the Irish Sea and move into Great Britain.
No, that isn't the position, certainly not the position of the government. I would firstly say, in terms of the excellent work Eddy and his teams do, they are brilliant men and women who go into very difficult contexts, and we're incredibly grateful for the work that they do. But not all of it is ports and airports, though that is clearly a point of vulnerability, and it makes sense, as we heard in the previous panel from NCA colleagues about matching up against threat, risk and harm. But there is, of course, another piece to this, which is those who are transiting that border for the purpose of claiming asylum, well, they wouldn't come in to force into interaction with Eddy's system, because at some point, generally relatively quickly after crossing the border, they're going to put an asylum claim in. We know that. That's information we've shared with the committee. I'm just as motivated by that. Mr. Robinson, you will know through the legislation that we've tabled, you'll know through our asylum policy statement, there are changes we have to make to the system where at the moment we are disproportionately attractive to our European neighbours. That's for everybody, so that UK isn't seen as a kind of a particularly disproportionately desirable part of the EU to get, part of Europe to get to.
Just finally, we heard that the Irish Republic and the Garda Síochána regularly board trains and buses, and when I asked Mr. Montgomery, he indicated that he doesn't have the power to do that in Northern Ireland. Have you ever been asked to provide that power legislatively?
That isn't something that we've made proposals to do.
No. Have you been asked by Border Force to provide that power to them?
No, I haven't. What we expect our teams to do is to interact with other agencies on the ground to use the suite of powers they have collectively in the best interests of an operational goal. That obviously you wouldn't expect to be something that ministers would be directing. As I've said to you, Mr. Robinson, fundamentally our interest is an intelligence-led response. If our intelligence tells us that would be an effective tactic in dissuading people to come, in breaking criminal models, then we would never take any options off the table to create the legislative environment collectively to make sure we could do those things. That isn't our current assessment.
Okay, Claire Hannah.
Thank you very much. Minister Patrick, in 2020, the Detail, which is an investigative journalism outlet reported that there were more immigration checks in Northern Ireland than there were in London, and anecdotally we hear that those checks have only increased, and in fact we hear from some that effectively Northern Ireland is one big border for a lot of people in terms of the checks that they are subjected to. We've heard this afternoon from the previous panel about the various dimensions of cooperation and data sharing with the Republic properly. We've also, colleagues will explore some of the deficits that Brexit has created in terms of that sharing. Are you concerned that all of this chat about how the border is the problem, which is obviously a political platform for many of those repeating it, is increasing anxiety and increasing racial tensions? And what opportunities do the government take to proactively demonstrate the grip that they have on this issue?
I'm concerned that people used the awful attack on Mr. Ogilvie for ends of anger and hatred. I don't think anyone could fail to be deeply shocked, worried and even angry when they saw what had happened to him. And I think there is a duty on everyone, be that Member of Parliament or Member of Community, to show that moral leadership and recognise what's happening, what some of those people are doing. But to the comments made before by Minister Norris, I don't think that means we should, for a second, dismiss legitimate concerns, and there are, about immigration and about checks. And I think it's appropriate that we're doing that, and I think it's been talked about whether there's appropriate resource, and that will, if I'm honest with you, I suspect that will be a conversation disputed for decades, right, about whether you're getting the right approach and where it sits. But I think our responsibility is to be clear-headed and see where there are issues that might fuel concerns, we tackle them, and where there are issues that malign actors try and make something out to cause disruption, that we tackle that at source. And that, I think you're going to come back in, but I think you asked me about another part.
Of course, and I think we've spent the afternoon properly, and as I say, where nobody is negating people's genuine anxiety, for example, in the crime that was the trigger point, as somebody said, for some of the disorder last week. And as I say, clearly there is cooperation, there is data sharing, there are extensive checks, but it is unclear if the government is proactively taking steps to reassure people in order to close down some of the space for those whose entire political platform is about hardening the border in Ireland or about increasing racial tension. Are you proactively reassuring people that you have that grip and that all appropriate enforcement and engagement is happening? Because we know that across the European Union, across the world, borders exist and cooperation happens. Are you doing that proactively, so to ensure that we're not increasing anxiety about it, increasing a clamour for effectively mass racial profiling in Northern Ireland, or as I say, a hardening of the border? Are you taking those opportunities to say, we have got this?
Well, I think you can see that, whether it's Secretary of State or myself or others, officials being very clear with communities in Northern Ireland. I spoke with many of them following that disorder. We spoke with some of the community groups that do on the ground work to kind of give that reassurance. And it wasn't, let me be really clear, those community groups weren't all saying, oh no, everything's fine, I don't know what's wrong. But for me, I'm struck by a conversation I had with one gentleman who just said, people don't feel listened to. Mm-hmm. And actually, it's not just listening, but it's also being seen to listen. And I think that's about respect. And I think people, if they don't feel listened to, don't feel respected. And I think we owe it to the people we serve that we do respect them and we listen carefully. And there's programmes I can speak to you about, but I think, look, this committee is doing part of that work, right? By holding our feet to the fire, by scrutinising our work, that will be part of the reassurance package that everything reasonably that can be done is being done. And Minister Norris has spoken about stepping it up, and I'll let him go into more detail on that.
Because, I mean, one of our challenges as a Home Office, and colleagues have not mentioned this yet, but doubtlessly will, is getting the right information to the right places at the right time. And traditionally, we've been really, really cautious about that because of an anxiety that it will create. My belief now is that in the age that we live in, with so much misinformation, so much disinformation, and outstanding digital tools for good or for bad, we've got to close that gap. you know, the committee will know getting out of this, and for good reasons, which I'll happily defend if pressed on, you know, getting information out on asylum claims in Northern Ireland has been difficult. It is right now, and I've written to the committee with that, because actually what that tells us is that claims are lesser in Northern Ireland than they are in the rest of the UK, certainly less than England. It says that, you know, the supported population per capita would be significantly below, I think, end up being half that of the northeast of England. But also being honest that there's a hyper-concentration in Belfast. And colleagues from Home Affairs Select Committee will know we had the same conversation about Glasgow a number of weeks ago. It's better that we put a name on that, because it's right that we're challenged on what to do about that. Now, that is a settlement that's built up over a very, very long period of time, actually for good reasons in terms of communities that chose to come forwards. But now, inevitably, challenges cohesion. And in my conversations with the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, they both said, Alex, you're not sharing information well enough on who's here and where they are. We're not asking for postcodes, but we need more to do our jobs better so we can have an honest conversation with the public about what is and isn't happening. We've not been very good at that traditionally. I'm trying to move that on at great pace. You know, again, HASC committee members will have heard me say I'm desperately trying to close the gap between the Home Office and devolved governments, the Home Office and local authorities, particularly in England as well. We're still on that piece, but that's the thing I think we have to do to get to an informed conversation. Because actually, I think this conversation on its merits itself, as Matt says, should be deflationary if people are giving it that kind of on the merits look.
You said you've spoken to the First Ministers and to the Executive. We've discussed this afternoon and elsewhere about, for example, the corrosive impact of paramilitaries and the failure to get a grip on that, as well as, I suppose, just completely stalled action on some of the quality of life issues around waiting lists, around lack of housing, economic opportunity that we know sometimes drive anxiety as well. We also know we don't have any sort of a cohesion strategy, efforts to de-radicalise and I suppose to properly address mythology. Have you, what engagement have you had with the Executive about their obligations and their deficits in this regard?
Well, when we spoke with party leaders just a few weeks ago, as you'll know that they were conversations initially not intending to be on this topic, but this featured quite heavily. It featured quite heavily about the duty we all have to call this out, but the duty we have to tackle this at all levels. So I think that is well known, well understood. What more we can do, I've mentioned before about the executive programme to tackle paramilitarism and organised crime. I've spoken about the investment we're making directly into the police. I spoke about the record settlement. There are community programmes alongside that we put money into. We are always looking for better ways that we might do this, because when you have a community in which people can so quickly take the actions that people did just a few weeks ago, that can't do anything but concern you. And if no one has a monopoly on good ideas, that we do our best to fund some of the brilliant groups that operate across Northern Ireland, our brilliant police service who do incredible work in very difficult circumstances. And if anyone has further ideas about what more we can do in UK government, I welcome it. We obviously work closely with the Executive. They have many of those responsibilities. And we try and support each and every one of those executive ministers, in their duties. And to your point before, if what drives some of this anger is a combination maybe of a predisposition to a concern about a certain group, but also a rise in your anger and your frustration, well, it's a twin track approach, which is you need to educate and prevent the former, but actually deliver properly. Deliver the housing that people need. Bring down the waiting lists in the health service that people are frustrated about. Now, when we've been speaking with the executive ministers, each and every one of them, I think, really recognise the challenge that they've got, and they are determined to deliver on it, and there are areas where you can point to real progress, but I think everyone would expect a budget to be set soon and delivery to go on more.
Well, I'll finish on this, because you have said, of course there's great ideas, of course there's great action, but it is reactive. There is no proactive strategy to address and prevent this, despite the fact that we've had 3 years of deliberate waves of racist violence. And I will leave you with the one point: you must see in all of this, as in so many other aspects of dysfunction, the hand of veto politics and of and of legitimate legislative opportunities and government action being thwarted by vetoes being deployed by political parties. And I hope that that is one of the things you are left with, that strategies that across the political spectrum people wish to see are being thwarted in part by political vetoes. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Belle Ribeiro Eddy, then Robin Swan before we move on.
Thank you, Chair. Unfortunately, race has always been used synonymously with immigration in public discourse, and I know that's certainly been displayed in the racist violence that we've seen against people who are actually lawfully meant to be in the UK or just black British citizens. I note that Neil Bassey, who is a former police national lead on counter-terrorism, has actually warned that far-right agitation over migration is the biggest national security threat facing the country. So I want to ask why the government hasn't yet taken any action against Elon Musk's Twitter platform for inciting violence in Belfast, and if you might have any plans to.
Well, Ms Ribeiro, you know the Online Safety Act arrangements in which we operate, Ofcom's locus in that. We as a government, of course, have a stake in it, but there is a cautious balance we have to find when we're talking about free. When we are talking about free speech, those platforms have to be used responsibly. There are sanctions there, and that is for the appropriate independent enforcement to assess. You will also know, and in fact I think you mentioned it in the previous panel, about the scope through the Representation of the People Bill to go further in making sure that that platforms are used responsibly around political discourse, which this is. So this is not something that is easy to do. What I would say also alongside it is that immunising communities is an important part of that as well, because we're not going to be able to stop people from getting that deluge of content, divisive content, but equipping people with the critical skills thinking and whatnot. That's the type of activity through protecting what matters that we want to see, and that cohesion, as I say, immunisation is got to be the first step.
Okay, thank you. Robin Swan.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Minister Morris. Just come back to a previous comment you said about the First and Deputy First Minister sharing data or asking Home Office for more data and more information, and that quality data is important for local delivery and local services in Northern Ireland. What role does mayors have in that in regards to their interaction with yourselves, with the Northern Ireland Executive and departments? Because surely they should be the data owner.
I mean, Mr Swan, you are right. And, this was subject to our session a couple of weeks ago with Home Affairs Committee on accommodation. Mayors have an incredibly important part to play, because they, at the very postcode level, number 57, that street level, have a lot of agency in terms of what happens. However, I would want you to hear, and I would want executive colleagues to hear, and the public to hear, the accountability and responsibility is mine. Mayors work for us through a contract funded by us. There has been, in my engagement with the executive, a clear sense from them that they don't feel they have the right interaction with our provider or with ourselves. That's my fault and my problem to fix. That's what we're doing, because again, there's virtually nothing they can't know. There's no good reason. I don't think there are certain agencies, PSNI being one of them, that would want postcode data, and that would be a reasonable thing to do. Certainly, at moments of disorder, you do need to know who is where. So I want us to be much clearer on that, but the provider have to act responsibly, because sometimes I wouldn't single out mayors necessarily. This is a contract for the support of 97,500 people at kind of last public statistics, the most vulnerable people in the country, because they're reliant on the state for accommodation and for food. They can't work. None of us, I don't think, and certainly even though our predecessor government wouldn't now, knowing what they know, would now provide that in 3 big contracts with a private provider in between the government and the communities. It's not a great model, so we're changing that model, and there's a lot of enthusiasm around the table for changing that model. But in the meantime, it's for us to work with the provider to make sure, if there are, because one of my challenges I get from all sorts of colleagues across the UK, they'll say, hang on a minute, there's a proposal for a property on this street. We're literally just opening up a provision for people who've got mental health issues. Don't put it next door. And there's lots we can do in those contexts to try and make sure we have sensible allocations. So it's a slightly long-winded way of saying they have got a really big role. We want them to be the best partners possible, but the accountability is mine. And if it's not working, the responsibility to fix it is mine.
So in regards to First and Deputy First Minister raising that issue in regards to not having that information, you're saying it's your responsibility. So have mayors no role in regards to interaction with the executive and Northern Ireland departments, or is that all through you? Because that's the way mayors have acted in the past.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, they are right to say that the responsibility and the accountability for decisions taken are mine. I would want a quick our view for our providers is we want them to have operational level, certainly individual property level conversations with whether it's local governments or devolved governments to say, to deal with either there's an issue with your tenants in this property, get on with it. They shouldn't have to call me, or they shouldn't have to call you for you to call me, for me to call my officials and them to call me. It's like we should be able to cut through there. So I want them in the room in the conversations that we're having at the moment. I want them in the room too, so that we can mutually agree ways of working that get the executive what they need to do their jobs. And I think that that's a perfectly deliverable end state.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Chris Murphy.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on the mayors question before I move on to another question. So obviously you've said mayors hold the contract for the whole of Northern Ireland. Can I ask firstly, what is the total cost of that contract, both in total and per asylum seeker per year? And then just one follow-up to that, which is community cohesion a KPI that mayors are held to account for by the Home Office in that contract? And how often do mayors breach their KPIs, both in terms of what they report to you, but also when you inspect them?
Mr. Murray, this would not be one of these sessions if you and I didn't have an arm wrestle over KPIs. I have to say, I don't know the answer to the question. I don't have that information with me. The quantum of the contract is, as we've discussed previously, that 4 billion figure. We've taken 1 billion out of this type of activity, which is good news. I'll follow up in writing there. As I say, the reason that for cohesion particularly, I don't go down a list of KPIs for mayors and say, oh, mayor's doing a good enough job on cohesion. That's my job. Now, they are an enabler or potentially a blocker in that, but me squeezing mayors or even pursuing perhaps service credits for mayors from that, I don't think would be an effective way of getting what we all want. So that's not the way in which I do it, which is in similar kind of vein to the conversation we had a number of weeks ago.
Yeah, okay, but when the Home Office, the taxpayer does contract mayors to do this, though, to the tune of billions of pounds. So if you could undertake to write to the committee with those 4 specific answers, and I'm happy to remind you what the questions were later on if that's helpful. I just want to move on to sort of trying to understand how the common travel area fits into the Home Office's wider tackling irregular migration challenges. We heard earlier, obviously there's a whole host of those. You know, we've got the small boats issues, and it was very positive to hear earlier that those are down by 50% boat crossings on their peak. There's also people overstaying their visas, there's people entering regular routes illicitly, transferring from other routes. How does the common travel area figure in your sort of matrix of risks to irregular migration threats to the UK?
First of all, I might say I probably didn't thank Mr. Capps for putting out that good news there. This is an issue. Small boats crossings is an issue that the public rightly are very frustrated with. I am pleased with the progress we're making, but we're nowhere near the end state. But Duncan's got an incredible service history of this country and is a great bloke, so I might forgive him. But nevertheless, we do have to match up against risk in its orders of magnitude. And again, it is important for the committee to know, as you've seen from the correspondence, that we've in 2025 had 1,517 applications for asylum in Northern Ireland. Not all of those came via a CTA border because people can come by overstaying their legal visas. It would be reasonable to say about 90% did, though. And then you set that against the scale, as has been said, 41,000 small boats crossings, give or take, slightly less, but not much less, for people overstaying the visas. So there are degrees of difference. So in terms of that matrix, as you say, in matching up against risk, then, of course, our deployments reflect that. However, on the bigger point, and this is a fundamental question for us as a government, for yourselves as a committee, and for Parliament as a whole, We run in this country at the moment, of the last 4 or 5 years, we run at 3 times the level of applications for asylum as we did even 10 years ago. And at more normal levels, or even split the difference levels, that means no hotels. That means reduced levels of dispersed accommodation in every community. That means an immigration conversation that is, obviously harder than it would be otherwise, and returning us to more normal levels, because of course there are more challenges in the world, be it conflict and climate, and there are very good reasons why people are displaced from their home. But that is set against a context where the European Union's figures has been falling, and ours until last year, we're starting to see a bit of a turn of the corner, ours have been increasing. So all of our activity around reducing pull factors, that is for every bit of the UK and for every border, because those who are choosing to make that journey, in this case, whether it's across the Channel or in this case across a land border, at the moment there is a sense that the UK is a really good place to do it, whether that's the ability to work illegally, whether that's being put up in a hotel, we're going to change that reality, whether that's in terms of speed of decision making, changing that reality. So as part that is all part of that same whole. I don't think that can be divided out.
Okay, and that, you sort of seem to be describing that as a sort of pan-UK challenge rather than specifically saying Northern Ireland is a particularly attractive part of the UK because it can be accessed via a land border from the common travel area. That's how I'm interpreting what you're saying. So my next question is, obviously the common travel area is over 100 years old, right? And in terms of what makes it rise up and down the risk of attracting illegal migrants over it, there's various variabilities. Obviously we've had the changes around Brexit. There's, as you push down in other parts of entry into the UK, small boats, for example, you've alluded to it might increase in other places. There's changing patterns. There's also people arriving into the common travel area from third countries through Ireland. What are you looking for to make it rise up your risk register, and at what point do you start allocating further resources to it?
Well, already it is elevated because the changes that we're talking about mean that the risk factors have increased, and obviously the most important thing to me is the data, but waiting for data when you already feel a risk, that's not a good way of doing policy. That's why we're already making the increases that we're making. That's why we are not only, in terms of immigration enforcement in general, doubling the spend, but disproportionately tilting that at Northern Ireland, because we know that the CTA is going to be a point of vulnerability. So we're doing it now, but the most important thing is, as always, data. The one thing we have going for us in this piece is that when it comes to asylum data, it does require the individual making a claim, so you do know who has come for that purpose, because they need to do that to get that purpose.
Thank you very much. And then final question is just on exactly how we analyse data and take data in. So obviously one of the risks is people come from a third country national, comes into the EU and then moves from mainland EU to Ireland, and then from there travels into the common travel area. Do we share a watch list with Ireland? So the same people will be on the watch list if they enter a UK port or airport as if they went through an Irish one. And then a coda to that question is, after we left the EU, we left instruments like SIS2 and PRUM and joint investigation teams and this whole host.
Arrest warrants.
And European arrest warrants, exactly. How is the lack of access to those European instruments an impediment to securing the common travel area?
Well, I mean, let me start with the second point first. I always want the maximum information I can have on any individual who's coming into the country. Like, that's got to be an unalloyed good thing. We do, the tests for anybody entering, and certainly into our asylum systems, they are subject to important biometric checks. We check against international databases, they get hits, and we work off that information. So that is a good picture. We have, it is a matter of record, that we have less access to data than we did prior to leaving the European Union, and that is where we find ourselves today. That is why the Prime Minister's so keen, that's why the Home Secretary's so keen, and why I'm so keen that we close that gap to our neighbours, and that's through the EU-UK summit process, but also we are working at that through our own bilateral process with Ireland as well. And we do that already around, people of concern, certainly when you're talking about organised criminals, as an answer to kind of your first point. But as I said in the previous answer, that is not at its end state yet. And we are really committed, and you can see this at the highest level at the Spring Summit. Both the PM and the Taoiseach said, this is a common goal for us to share data better to its fullest purpose. And that's where we've got to get to. We're not at that end state today.
Okay, just keeping an eye on the time, I'm going to go Katrina Murray, then Margaret Mullane, please.
I just want to follow on from my colleague from Edinburgh East and Musselburgh, who I will put on the record is not related to me in any way whatsoever. But are you satisfied that there are sufficiently robust processes in place at entry points to Ireland from outside the common travel area to prevent the entry of people who intend to reach the UK illegally? And if not, what more needs to be done?
I mean, the securing of the borders of the Republic of Ireland are a matter for their ministers, their democratic arrangements and their public. We work really closely with them. They're very, very valued partners who I think have a shared motivation. So it's not something that I have raised with ministers as a concern, or to my knowledge others have either. I know how seriously they take this, and that's a partnership that we see as a common goal.
Sorry, just can I come in briefly? So the liaison officer that's in Cork, what's the relationship there and what authority?
Well, you heard from Mr. Capps about that kind of embedded responsibility. That is common, I would say, across law enforcement agencies, either of a shared geography or a different one. I can't speak to the nature of that engagement. It's more operational than I think a minister would be engaged in. But I think that type of arrangement's a really good one because it closes the gaps between organisations, it closes the gaps between countries, so that that joint work can happen as a matter of routine.
Okay, thank you, Margaret Mullane.
Thank you, Chair. Great to see you again, Minister Norris. To what extent do the UK and the Republic of Ireland coordinate, do you think, asylum and immigration policies?
We have different policies. We have different geographies, different policies. They, of course, are a member of a union of nations who collectively set their policies. There are going to be differences. Now, both parties to any border, and that's true for Ireland, but it's also true for France, are conscious of different convictions that can be driven by different policy choices. So that, of course, is factored into our thinking. But as I said to Ms Murray, that's not something that I think is of a particular concern to us, but nevertheless we're mindful of it. But it is their business, and it must be their business to make their decisions on their borders.
Would you say that, there's been a lot of work done on the kind of soft work between countries. We've got together, we've discussed stuff, common ground, like what you're saying. We are different, but however, what can we do together? So what do you think the steps you've taken to manage the risk that there's different asylum policies in the UK and Ireland, and encourage misuse of the CTA?
Well, first of all, it's to change the things about us that make us differentially attractive. The end state for our system is one of better order and control, and that gives us the space to open up, which I think there'll be a lot of enthusiasm in this room for safe and legal means of coming to the country. That's where we're getting to. That's our journey. That's our stated purpose as a government. We're not at that point yet. There are things that make us differentially attractive, and that's a conversation, as you well know, not least because it played out in the public domain, that, say, our neighbours in France have raised before, about saying what our intelligence is telling us is that people want to get to the UK because they think they're going to work illegally and they're going to be able to live in a hotel. And we're changing that reality, and again, we're making some very good progress in that space. So for me, it's about having an ordered, controlled, compassionate, fair system that means people don't have to make dangerous journeys to come to this country. I still think we're short of it on the data piece, as I've said. I think we're making significant strides, and I would encourage colleagues to support us at second reading on our immigration legislation next week. I'll possibly run ahead of the business statement. I may have to resign by the time I get to my desk. In due course, on our legislation when that comes forwards, because there are still things we have to change. So I am concerned with getting our house in order, but of course we talk to our neighbours about what we're doing, and we listen to see what they're doing, not least because we might want to nick their ideas.
Is there anything that you want to share with us that you have thought that's a great idea, or can you not share it with us?
Well, I don't think the Home Secretary's enthusiasm for Denmark is a secret. You know, we've looked very closely. I meet my counterparts from all around, particularly Europe, but people from around the world, and we talk about this in great detail. And I've never had a conversation in life that I haven't learned something from. But I certainly, with regards to meeting with our counterparts, I learned something from all of those engagements, because we've got some good ideas, and I think, you know, that we're demonstrating the progress with them. But, you know, we're never at an end state on that.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Chair. In regards to that relationship between ourselves and the Republic of Ireland about the return of third country nationals, can you tell us how many people the UK has actually returned to the Republic? 500
last year. 500, was it last year or was it since the election, Eddie? You might have since the general election, 500.
And do you then track their follow-on status if the Republic of Ireland send them back to the third country?
No. I mean, we affect significant numbers of returns. We've affected nearly 70,000 since the general election, the moment at which there is a safe and secure handoff from ourselves to a receiving country. That is their business then. We, of course, through our systems, pick up if people seek to come back, which, you know, given generally when people are asked to leave, they have bars to their returns. If they seek to test that, then we seek to return again. So, but we wouldn't routinely be asking them what then happens. That's their business.
Okay. Well, of those 500, you set up the next question, unfortunately, Minister Moore. Of those 500, how many are returns? How many tried to come back the second time, third time?
I couldn't tell you that today, which is why I don't know, unless you have Eddy with it. No. We'd have to follow up in writing on that piece.
But you would have that information?
We will know when people seek to re-return, yes.
So in the last session, and you were in the gallery, Minister Norris, Davy Beck from the PSNI talked about the importance of biometrics in regards to being able to actually manage that whole system. Where are you in regards to achieving that with the Irish government?
You know, this is something we committed to collectively in the spring, so we are working through that. These things, quite rightly, have a lead in time, but we want to be able the maximum data sharing as soon as possible is our goal. That's true for the Government of Ireland. That is true for the rest of the European Union as well. And those are again negotiations and engagements that we're actively involved in.
Okay. Reversing in the first question in your first answer, 500 have been returned to the Republic of Ireland. The Irish government have used the language in the past that the majority of their illegal or irregular migration are actually coming through the UK. So what's the reverse? How many illegal or irregular immigrants of the Republic of Ireland returned to the UK?
They say theirs is 80%. We contest that data a little bit because it was snapshot data of a particular month's worth of data. The conversations we're having at the moment are to establish those facts, because, you know, we are having a conversation, and I know that whether it's in Northern Ireland or in anywhere else in the UK, there is the perception about the flow over the CTA from Ireland to ourselves. There is also the same mirroring conversation happening in the Republic too. We have to have these things based on the facts, and that's, you know, increasing and enhancing that data is our goal.
500 for the first answer?
Yeah. I only know, sorry, in their percentage terms, I'd have to follow up with the committee on that.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to finish with Karen Bradley.
Thank you. So you'll have noticed from my previous comments that I'm exercised by entry-exit system and its interaction with the CTA. I travelled into Ireland this week. I flew back last night from Dublin. It appeared to me that I was having to have my passport checked in a way that I didn't used to under CTA. So I'm concerned about that. I'm also concerned about the impact more widely on EES to UK nationals over the course of this summer. We, members of the committee, visited the Port of Dover on Thursday and saw the incredible investment they've put in, but they can't use any of it because the French system hasn't been switched on. So, Minister, what are you going to do, first of all, to make sure that the common travel area is properly respected and that we don't end up having some form of passport check by the back door? And then secondly, what are you going to do around all those people who are hoping to travel to the continental Europe over the summer, and all those lorry drivers and freight companies who are going to be very concerned about their cargo?
Well, first of all, arrangements with the CTA, as was said by Mr. Murray, over a century old, 103 years old, and they are unchanged. and we take any cases where that's not the case very seriously, and will very happily raise them to ensure that is how it works operationally. EES...
There, the Irish nationals had to do the same as I did to go through passport checks. However,
that's no more comfort to me, I'm afraid.
More comfort.
That's because, again, the arrangements are unchanged for them too, as they were for yourself. I mean, EES is a concern. That's why we've put the significant investment that we've put into the juxtaposed ports. You know, these are arrangements put in place by our neighbours, and their operations are fundamentally for them to do. In my engagement as a neighbour, seeking access for our people at peak times, where there's a lot of people going through the juxtaposed ports, what we've been successful in so far since the system's been turned on, and what we continue to prioritise both with France and the Commission and any other EU partner, is that when the system gets stressed, which new systems will and do, they prioritise flow over compliance, and that has been the case so far.
But the problem is that the system hasn't been switched on in terms of using the I mean, you know, the 90-odd terminals that we saw at Dover, the many that there are at St Pancras, the many that there are at the shuttle, they're there, but they can't be switched on.
No, but what you're seeing in lieu of those are kind of interim arrangements at booths that are not the intended end state and are themselves much slower. So we will support in whatever way we can our partners to get their system running as they wish it to. It's a good thing that they're doing what they're doing. You know, your neighbours putting in very good controls is a really good thing. Of course, these things take time to build up, but in the meantime, whatever arrangements they're using, whether it would be full compliance, whether it's workarounds, we want them to prioritise flow, and that's the nature of our engagement, whether it's myself, whether it's the Cabinet Office, because we know that there's a major pinch point coming already.
What we heard was that once the flow is affected, that's too late. This needs to be preemptive action. We heard very strong evidence from community groups in Dover as well as the port themselves that what happened over May, bank holiday, was not acceptable to the people who live in that area. So can you please use your good office to put pressure on the Commission and the French government to suspend the checks over July and August when we know there's going to be difficulties? I think probably about the third week of July there might be something that you, Minister, might find it important not to have headlines about traffic going into Dover. Maybe some headlines on other matters might be something you'd be keen on. So can I urge you to do that, please?
I mean, if Dame Karen, if you worry for my job security, I always work out that I've got the one job nobody's trying to steal from. not least for this for this very reason, to assure the committee we are having that engagement on a very, very, very frequent basis. I think full suspension is deeply unlikely, but the end state is one that I share with the committee. That is what we're working with our partners to do in the implementation of their system.
Does anybody want to add anything?
Can I just ask?
If I could, Chair,
Yes.
DG Police Health Frontier is actually visiting Dover today as part of our ongoing cooperation, being hosted by DG Border Force. That is a very live conversation, obviously something we're very concerned about.
I mean, even just on a port-by-port basis, I think Dover and Eurotunnel, etc., very much an issue. And clearly our entry exits actually are working phenomenally well, so credit to the Home Office for that. You know, we're not seeing the problems at our ports, but yes.
Well, some of my constituents think that small boats are arriving on the shores of Northern Ireland. Can you just...
They are not.
Thank you very much for putting that on the record. Thank you.
Okay, order.